Hey, welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast, where really it's such an honor and delight for me to bring Bernardo Kastrup back. I always look so forward to my conversations with him because I learned so much. He's really one of the great minds for me today. And so I'll do an abbreviated version of his extensive bio. And then we're going to jump into, oh, for sure, some really cool topics. So Bernardo Kastrup is the executive director of Essentia Foundation. His work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy, ontology, philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering, reconfigurable computing, artificial intelligence. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked for the European Organization for Nuclear Research, otherwise known as CERN, and the Phillips Research Laboratories. He's also the author, I think, at least a dozen books now, Bernardo, and
Yeah,
his output is prolific and profound. And so really I know how busy you are these days. You're turning into a total rock star. And so I'm so delighted that you have the time and the willingness to hang out with us. It really means a lot.
always a pleasure to dialogue with you,
Yeah,
regardless of whether this will be a popular video or not.
right. Yeah. I mean, really, I learned so much. It's really just remarkable. And like I mentioned the first time we chatted, one of the delightful challenges with you is the scope and the depth of your work. It's really quite literally breathtaking. And so I always have to struggle like, oh my gosh, what are we going to talk about this time? But I wanted to maybe unpack a little bit more from what we did talk about our last conversation about the implications, some of the implications of idealism and paren the dreamlike nature of reality. As you know, or may not know, I'm very, very deep into dream yoga. It's been a main practice of mine. I've written a number of books on it. I've been a student of it from the Tibetan tradition, from the Hindu tradition, the Mandukya Upanishad, arguably one of these central, most profound Upanishads is largely about the nature of reality being dreamlike. And so there's so many extraordinary implications here that I want to explore with you. One is if we really grasp the profundity, the embrace of the dreamlike nature of reality, you write so beautifully in your book, More Than Allegory, and I can see now why it is your favorite book. When I finally got to read it, especially part three, Bernardo, I was just blown away. I mean, amazing stuff. So cool, just
Thank you.
so cool. So in this book, you write really elegantly about if reality is in fact made of mind and in fact can be viewed as a type of dream. Um, you write about the power of myth, meaning, allegory. And so I'm wondering if you could run a little bit more on learning how to read properly the sign language of reality, kind of dream interpretation brought to a whole new level. A friend of mine, Robert Moss, coined this very interesting term, chiromancy, from the Greek god Kairos, who's the god of opportunity, which is his languaging for being opportunistic and actually extracting meaning from the world. And so the question for me, Bernardo, is how far can we take this? Because on one level, I think it's just extraordinarily elegant to open the aperture of our awareness to the extent that we can, in fact, derive, interpret meaning from our world. But where does one cross the line between that and the imputation of meaning? Because if you have too much meaning, then that's paranoia. And so somewhere in there seems to be a middle line that on one level, geez, I got bed bugs last night. What does that mean, right? Or like Charles Manson listening to the Beatles in reverse. What is the universe trying to tell me? And so the reason I situate this within the context of dream interpretation altogether is because, as you know, dreams occur across a spectrum from mere neurological noise to hyperlucid theophantic dreams that can change your life because they're so profound. And so could you talk a little bit more about the proper reading of reality, the derivation of meaning, the extraction versus the imputation of meaning?
Yeah, the central idea is that there is a reality out there that is not made of my mental states or your mental states. But that reality too is made of mental states, not yours, not mine, but mental nonetheless. And when we observe reality what appears on the screen of perception is the result of an interaction between our inner mental states and the external mental states of the world. Now, this interaction is symbolic in nature because that's how mind works. When mind needs to reference something else, it references that through symbol, through allegory, through metaphor. Because these metaphors evoke the appropriate or the adequate meaning. Even language originally was entirely metaphorical. We would speak in terms of metaphor, like time flows. That's a metaphor. Sorry, no. Time is a river.
Mm.
That's a metaphor. And the metaphor comes from the notion that time flows just like a river flows. But before you have the concept of flow, which is sort of high level, more or less modern concept. If you look at pre-literate groups in the world, their vocabulary and their conceptual dictionaries is relatively small. So when you don't have the concept of flow, all you can do is time's a river.
Mm.
That's what you say.
Mm.
So mind works that way. So when we interact with the world outside, what we see is not the states of the world as they are in themselves.
Mm.
To experience that, you need to be the world outside. What we see is how those states present themselves to our observation when they interact with us. You can regard this as the dashboard indicators on an airplane. The airplane sensors make measurements of the states of the sky outside, and those measurements are presented to the pilot in the form of dashboard indicators. Now, those indications correlate with the states of the sky outside, but they don't look like the sky outside. They look completely different. You have to take them seriously, but not think that the airplane's dashboard is the sky. Same thing for our perception. We make measurements with our sense organs of the states of the world. The results of those measurements are presented to us as the screen of perception, the colors we see, the flavors we taste, the textures we feel, the sounds we hear. These too are dashboard indications. In other words, they are symbols, they are metaphors that point to something true about the external states of the world, but these metaphors aren't themselves the states of the world. And that's what we think they are. We think what we perceive is the world as it is, which is untenable from a physical perspective, from a game theory perspective. There are all kinds of arguments why this is impossible. And then the question arises, okay, if perception, if what appears in perception is symbolic, what is it indicating? What is it pointing to? What is the underlying meaning of the world? And under analytic idealism, everything in perception has a meaning. So you made a point of caution there that it's a danger to start attributing meaning to everything, right? Like, a mosquito bit me on the left side last night. What does that mean? No, this is dangerous. But it's dangerous not because there is no meaning to what happened. Everything has a meaning. It's dangerous because we are fantasizing meanings that may have nothing to do with the actual meaning of the thing as anchored by the real states of the world outside. We project onto perception our own fantasies, our own narrative making, our own paranoias. Sometimes we find correlations between things that are entirely created by us. Paranoid schizophrenics do that. I don't think this means that not everything in the world has a meaning. I think everything does have a meaning, but it's often not what we think it is by processing our fears and fantasies and paranoias at the ego level. It's something deeper. And the question is how to find it then, how to have any confidence about it. Well, the easy answer, but also the true answer is intuition.
Mm.
But to learn to discern true intuition from our egoic fantasy making is very hard, at least in the beginning. There comes a point where it's not hard anymore. The real intuition has a certain smell, has a certain impersonal tone to it. It doesn't really acquiesce to our fantasies or our beliefs or our innate tendencies and associative thinking. It seems to be something very objective, external, that is given, and not that is made up. Um, but I don't have the 7 steps to making that distinction. I myself often cannot make that distinction. It's very hard to make it. There are times in which it's very clear to me, oh, no, this is not mine. This is not my own fantasy making, my own storytelling. This is so alien. This is so weird. And it feels so
Mm.
real, so compelling. This is true intuition. But that's not always the case.
Well, that's really, it's wonderful to hear from you because as a rationalist, I like your description of yourself as a naturalist. I think that's lovely. But you bring an extraordinary armamentarium with your intellect and your power to reason. And yet, if I'm hearing you properly here, Bernardo, you seem to be intimating the primacy of metaphor, the primacy of associative analogical thinking, or mythopoetic renderings of reality, and that what we know as logic and rationality is actually derivative of that, that on some level, this is the primary way of knowing our world, right?
That's how mind works. That's how mind has always worked, and it's not even polemical. You know, all you have are your experiences, the contents of your mind. That's all you have. That's all you have ever had. All you can ever have. Um, so all you can do is to find patterns of similarity across experiences, across mental contents, and therefore link them together by some underlying meaning that seems to anchor those similarities in a common origin. That's all we can do. Everything else is theorizing. It's a form of conceptual fantasizing that is very useful. So when somebody in science says there literally is an invisible force that acts at a distance between bodies, pulling them together, and it's called gravity, it's a literal force. That's nonsense. That's something that only a very naive scientist does. The theoretical entities of scientific theories are convenient fictions. In other words, everything that is relevant seems to happen as though those fictions were true, and that allows us to predict what nature will do next, which is the litmus test of scientific theories. Can we predict what will happen next? So convenient fictions are convenient fictions that allow us to predict what will happen next. They are not necessarily literally true. They have never been. When Newton came up with gravity as this invisible force, the French laughed for half a century because invisible forces acting at a distance is mystical woo-woo. It's nonsense. And then in the 19th century, the force of gravity was literally true. And then after the turn of the 20th century, there came Einstein and said, there is no such force at all, which is what we largely believe today. Gravitational attraction is just a sort of bending and twisting of the very fabric of space-time. It's not a force that acts instantaneously at a distance. It's not instantaneous. We know of gravitational waves today. And we believe that still today, even though the leading edge of physics is telling us not even that is true. There is something else going on. Gravity may be something of an related to entropy, or loop quantum gravity sort of reframes the whole thing in different terms. So there is no literal truth etched in stone in nature, because nature is a grand collection of experiences that have built into them immanent patterns of similarity, and we can identify those patterns to make predictions, but that's all there is. So even what we call the literal entities of science, like atoms and force fields and force carrying particles and all that stuff, singularities, even those are metaphors, because they are mental creations of ours, but the world behaves as though those mental creations were true. In other words, there is a correlation, an isomorphism, a pattern of similarity between our own internal models and nature. That too is a metaphor. Everything is only ever a metaphor, except the very existence of mind, that within which metaphors reside.
Yes, fantastic. I mean, what brings to mind, this is so rich as usual, there's a wonderful line from a practice I do quite regularly called the sadhana of Mahamudra. And interesting, Mahamudra literally means the great seal or the great symbol. And so your interpretation of this has really helped me understand the centrality of the Mahamudra teachings. And there's a wonderful line in the practice I do that basically says phenomena are all the books one needs. And again, so I'm going to return. I want to press just a tiny bit on this because this can have really interesting potential revelatory power when it comes to things like disease. And I speak with some personal potency here because a couple of years ago, completely predicted, by the way, through a hyperlucid dream I had 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I'm a super fit, death-denying kind of guy, right? And it was like, whoa, this is a really pretty serious wake-up call. And so thus began, Bernardo, a really concerted effort. WTF, what am I not seeing? What have I missed? What am I not reading properly? And so long story short, it led me to explore entheogen psychedelics, which I'm not prone to do because I'm such a straight-laced conservative. That completely blew open massive arenas of exploration and insight for me. And then finally, through a psychedelic-assisted psilocybin therapy session, oh my gosh, it's just click, click, click. The whole thing came together. And I realized this is exactly what this dis-ease is representing, symbolizing, and in a certain sense, screaming out to me. I don't want to beat myself up for it because, like you often say, I don't have the hubris to say I created this cancer, but I do believe behaviorally I unwittingly contributed to it. And so when this insight came to me, this is a real game changer for me in terms of some behavioral strategies, which are just unconscious to me. So my body, my unconscious mind, Candace Pert says this. I'm curious how that lands with you. Your body is your unconscious mind. Here's my body expressing something that with such a kind of undeniable proclamation, I had no choice but to pay attention to it. So long-winded statement about how can we use this approach to reality to help us understand, literally stand under things like disease and what disease might represent. Could this in fact portend a new type of diagnostic and even prescriptive approach to what we talk about as disease, the representational nature of it?
Let me start with a disclaimer because there is a very common misinterpretation of idealism. When an idealist says all nature is mental, people have the tendency to think, well, I am a mind. If all nature is mental, therefore I can control everything. No, that's not an implication of idealism. Idealism says nature is mental, but it's mental states out there. They are not part of your ego. Neither does your ego have control over the whole of nature. If it had, I promise you, there would be happening no war in Ukraine right now because I would have stopped it before it even started. Now, I can't stop it. So obviously, I cannot, I do not, as an individual ego, Bernardo Kastrup, I do not have control over the mental states of nature. So what this means is that if something bad happens to you, it's most likely not your fault. It's the broad, unfathomably gigantic dynamics of nature that operates around us and through us. Most of it, we don't have any control of. Even your unconscious mind, which I think is conscious, it's just not metacognitive or it's
Yeah,
dissociated from the ego.
totally.
Even that is not under the control of your ego. Your ego is dissociated from that. So you don't have a full control over the dynamics of your dissociated mind. Does that mean that we can at least control diseases? No, because I think the body is what these dissociated aspects of our own mind, dissociated from the ego, for very good evolutionary reasons. I mean, you don't need to attend to kidney function or liver function in the way you need to attend to the tiger around the corner, because kidney function, liver function, these are autonomous functions. So everything that is autonomous is most profitably or has highest fitness if it is dissociated from the ego, so it doesn't distract the ego from paying attention to the bloody tiger behind the tree or paying attention to where you can find the good fruit or the water to drink. So it's functional that the mental states that present themselves to us as physiology, as an anatomy, but they are dissociated from the ego. So our control over them is very limited. So people shouldn't go down, at least that's my view. I think it's unjustified for people to start going down those guilt trips of, oh, I have a condition, I have cancer, or I have this or that, it's my fault. No, I would take it in principle off the table. Now, can you influence it? Surely. Mental states can influence one another every day. Have a negative thought and see what happens to your emotions, or engage or indulge in a negative emotion and see what happens to your thoughts later that day. Mental states of very distinct qualities impinge on one another and causally influence one another. I discussed cancer at length with a person who I think is the most important scientist alive, Michael Levin.
Yes,
I
I know Michael Levin's work in your dialogues. What an amazing individual, right? Jeez.
I think he has the best chance of all scientists alive today to find a general cure for cancer.
Yeah.
Not one or a few types of cancer, but cancer overall, in general, all of them. And no, I cannot say. He will publish his stuff.
Sure.
Um, I discussed this at length with him, and I will not speak for him, but my position, which I think he's sympathetic to, is that cancer is what a certain form of internal dissociation looks like.
Yep.
When a certain part of our inner mental states in the so-called unconscious mind become dissociated from the general body plan, or become dissociated from the general structure and dynamics of what we are, the mental structure and dynamics of what we are. Because that's exactly what it looks like. What is cancer is when certain cells forget, between scare quotes, forget that they are part of a bigger plan and they go off on their own road, on their own path. They try to survive and forgetting that they are part of a larger body plan, a larger template of mental dynamics. They pursue their own separate mental dynamics. So a cancer is not a monster out to kill you. In killing you, it kills itself. That's not what it's trying to do. A cancer is a form of dissociation, is when you lose contact with part of something that before was really yourself. And then the problem is that our modern attitude to cancer can only exacerbate it, because what do we think when we think of cancer? Oh,
Fight it.
extirpate it, kill
Yeah.
it, fight it. It's the enemy, it's a demon within. We have to poison it, we have to remove it. And make no mistake, we may have to poison it. We may have to extract it, because until we find a better way to deal with it, I am all for following medical guidelines, because what medicine does is try a bunch of things and see what works best. And that's what the guideline is. It's what has worked best so far. So I would follow them, but I would avoid that inner mental attitude of this is my enemy within and I'm out to kill it. Um, I, I, I haven't been diagnosed with cancer. I have many friends who have, but I like to think, I mean, I only know once I'm there, right? But I would like to think that my own attitude towards it would be, I'm sorry this happened to you. That's
Mm.
what I would be telling the cancer.
Yeah, that's
And
real.
I'm sorry if this has been my fault, because I didn't pay attention to myself, to my inner states, to my
Yep.
inner emotions, to my repressed material, or to my own body. I'm sorry. I didn't want this to happen. And you are not my enemy. Let's come back together like we were before. We are one. It just appears that we are separate. That would be my inner attitude, even if I'm going to surgery to extirpate the thing, or if I'm, being subjected to a chemotherapy, even while poisoning it, that's what I would try to have as inner attitude towards it, a form of compassion. Because I think our cultural attitude towards cancer is vastly inadequate. The way we think about it is vastly inadequate. I'm not saying that cancer medicine is inadequate. It's the best we've got, and we should go for it. We should use it. But our mental attitude, our inner state when we face the reality of cancer, the inner state that our culture encourages, like a battle against cancer, a fight. I think that it's an inner state that only exacerbates the issue to begin with, because the issue that began it is a form of separation. And if you then turn the thing that has been separated from you into an enemy, what do you think? That you will reduce the separation?
Right.
You're not going to reduce any separation.
It's
Now, the meaning of it, Andrew, I mean, who am I to say, right? We are just sharing thoughts here for what they are worth. I think sometimes some forms of cancer may be a reflection of a certain egoic conscious attitude, yes, but not all. Cancer seems to strike all kinds of people with all kinds of mental attitude in all phases of life. Um, so there is something there, at least part of it, that isn't really personal. It's part of the processes of nature. It's not something that is caused by us. We are not gods. We didn't cause everything when it comes to our bodies or to the sum total of our inner mental states, because most of them are separated from the ego, which is what we think of as ourselves. Some of them are related to the dynamics of the world out there. On the screen of perception, you could think of the stuff you eat, the air you breathe, which carries particles that were released into the air, maybe on the other side of the world. And there may be other dynamics of nature that science had still not modeled or even identified, which may play a role into this. There may be mental dynamics that have to do with this is dangerous territory. That's why I'm paying so much attention. It's so easy to misinterpret what I want to say. There may be a non-personal, non-individual perspective, a perspective from high above, when there is an overview of the sum total of the dynamics of nature on this planet. There may be a perspective in which things we consider exclusively bad may have a role to play. It's just a role that we can't see because we are immersed in this local dynamics surrounding us. We don't have that broader, higher perspective. And cancer may not be an exception to this. We die, and we have to die of something.
Yeah.
Something has to happen at some point. Or cancer may be unrelated to death. I have a friend who has prostate cancer, and so most people who have prostate cancer go to their doctors and say, take it out, I cannot live with it, even though often that's not the recommended way forward. So this friend of mine, he wouldn't say that, but he's enlightened by nature. He's a corporate executive, by the way. He's not a spiritual guy at all. He went to his doctor, to his specialist, and asked, do I need to remove it? And then his doctor looked at him and said, statistically, based on all of our models, no. And then he said, okay.
Yeah, beautiful.
And he proceeded to forget about it, except once a year when he has to repeat his biopsy.
Yep.
And he forgot to tell it to me and another friend of ours who are always together. We are always meeting. He forgot to tell to us for 2 years that he had cancer, because he was told that for now he didn't need to do anything before the next meeting with us. So between his diagnosis and the next meeting with us, he had already dropped it completely off his radar screen. And you see, there are people who have cancer and die with it, not of it.
That's right.
There has been a study years ago of car crash victims, people who died in car crashes. Why car crashes? It's because it's a great statistical sample. Car crashes do not kill people who were ill or only older people. No, they kill everybody, young, healthy, older, unhealthy. So it's a very objective sampling of the population. About half of the people have early beginning small cancerous tumors that do not proceed forward. They die out on their own, or they get resolved on their own. But if you get a diagnosis before it sorts itself out, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to treat it. And you should, because chances are, if you don't, it's going to get you, and you should treat it. But what I mean is this firm association we make between cancer and death, that association itself may be taking our eyes off the ball. Even if you know you have cancer, maybe it's your mind talking to yourself about things you have to pay attention to. Or maybe it's not your mind at all. Maybe it's part of the broader dynamics of nature and there is nothing to think about. There is nothing to interpret. I mean, there is something to interpret, but at a level, from a perspective that monkeys cannot achieve, and we are monkeys, that monkeys cannot achieve. I spoke a lot. I don't know whether
No,
I
no, it's extraordinarily rich as usual, and I want to share a couple things here. Is because I cultivate so actively a very rich dream life. I in fact had another lucid dream around this, where it was extraordinarily clear that my body was also telling me that this cancer was not malevolent. It was a really powerful dream that said, I am not a bad phenomena here. And so that was also revelatory. But I wanted to come back to a couple of things that I think are so key. This complete reverse relationship to disease. I mean, the West is what? I mean, look at all the antis that we have: antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, antiemetics. Everything is anti. And so that in itself is indicative of this relationship that is the complete reverse of what you're suggesting here, is that you're having an unruly, perhaps dissociated aspect of your being that is somehow doing this thing, perhaps sending a message of disconnect or not, but reversing our relationship to it, opening to it instead of closing down to it, relating to it, communicating with it, perhaps even opening, like, what do you have to teach me? What am I not hearing? That's the way I related to my disease. But also connected to this, Bernardo, I love this notion. I want to talk about this in relationship to the meta-crisis, because to me, when we have these dissociations, exactly like you say, it's a process of forgetfulness, and healing and holding. These are acts of remembrance. Healing is about remembrance. This ties in very deeply to spiritual practices, because I think it's very easy to argue that the essence of spiritual practice is remembrance. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how far this goes. That when I look at your work, and you talk about dissociations and in more than allegory, you introduce the image of protrusion, which I just really spoke to me. Is it too facile in this, using the kind of license that's given to us by chaos and complexity theory, self-similarity, universality, the fractal nature of reality? Is it in fact too simplistic and facile to say that things like cancer, or the cancer that's taking place in society at large, are basically dissociation upon dissociation upon dissociation, fracture upon fracture, protrusion upon protrusion, and really forgetfulness upon forgetfulness? That basically the fracture upon fracture upon fracture leads to a meta-fracture, what we call the meta-crisis. And so to me, it's like, well, this has a tremendous amount of explanatory and prescriptive power, because if in fact this is true, in the healthy sense of reductionism, the way you riff on it, this is reductionism from the complex to the simple. Boy, does this speak to me, that if we can somehow work our way down to the primordial fractures, and I think I want to share some stories about how I've been working with that. Is it in fact too facile convenient to say, boy, just work your way down, follow like Hansel and Gretel, follow the fractures back to their source, and work with this, like Platonic anamnesis, right? Memory, 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 instead of forgetfulness, forgetfulness, forgetfulness. Does that land with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we started our discussion talking about symbols, metaphors, associations of meaning, associations of similarity between mental states as one of the fundamental dynamics of mind. Mind associates, mind finds similarities in order to connect two things. In other words, metaphors, analogies. The other side of that very same coin is dissociation. So you could say that mind has one primary process with two facets, two aspects, and they are the reversed side of the coin from one another. One is association, meaning making. The other one is dissociation. And these are the primary processes of mind. And I think ultimately we will be able someday to explain all nature on the basis of these two fundamental processes, associations and dissociations. So yes, I think dissociation is a critical part of our conceptual dictionary to make sense of things, because it's the counter side of association or meaning making. What I think um, and this is my personal opinion. It is grounded in idealism and you know my own philosophical views, which are objectively argued. Uh, but you could say it's an interpretation of those views. So it's more personal, less objective than the rest of my work. But my view in this regard, what, you can take it in the form of a sort of a disclaimer because I see it happening a lot in Western culture. Um, we have convinced ourselves, and Western culture now is across the world. It's in South Korea, it's in Japan, it's in China. I have probably I haven't seen more Westerners anywhere else than in Shanghai, a city I visited many, many, many times over the years. It's very materialistic. It's very money oriented. It doesn't get much more Western than that. To really feel China, you have to go into the the interior, go into the countryside. But we've convinced ourselves in Western culture, which is now global, that our lives are about us. And therefore, we frame every problem as a personal problem. And I would warn against that. And I have an apple tree there in my garden, on the side of my garden. And every year at around this time of the year, I go appreciate the apple blossoms. I love apple blossoms. I don't know why. It's something that was with me since very young. And sometimes I fantasize, imagine if one of these apple blossoms were to convince itself that its life is about it. It would be ridiculous. It would be a vastly neurotic apple blossom. It cannot see what's really going on from its individual perspective. It does not know that what it must do in the great scheme of things is to attract the bees and then allow itself to die. So the seed can be freed and become a fruit that drops to the ground and then eventually leads to another apple tree. And so the dynamics of life goes on. But if it becomes a neurotic, dissociated apple blossom, once it starts withering in late spring, it will go like, oh my God, no, I'm withering. How do I live? What do I have to do? So I go back to being a young apple blossom. What do I do so I can continue to live? Well, imagine if every apple blossom would be neurotic like this and succeed. That would be the end of apple trees and apples. So I would warn against this idea in the West that our lives are about us. Why? Why would they be about us? It's a completely arbitrary, unjustifiable idea. Life is about life. Life's about nature. There is something enormous going on here that it would be incredibly naive for us to think that we've understood or corralled into our conceptual schemas. Of course, we don't know really what's going on. So there is a certain letting go that I think is very natural, but we lost touch with. And this idea of association in dissociation being portrayed as a conflict, which is not what they are. The dissociation of an apple blossom so it can wither away and give rise to an apple, and then the next apple tree, is not a conflict. It's a dynamic process of joining and unjoining and then rejoining. That's the dynamics of nature. So it's not an antithesis. It's not a conflict. It's not a fight. But, and now you should not feel that I am singling out any culture here. This is just an observation. The Anglo-Saxon culture is known to be one that frames things in terms of conflict. This is well known. And it's not the only type of culture. There are 5 cultural dimensions. And framing things in terms of conflict is only one cultural dimension. There are at least other 4 cultural dimensions. And cultures score different values along those 5 different dimensions. So there are many, many varieties of ways to sort of frame the problem of life, not always as a conflict, which doesn't mean that framing it as a conflict is not important, valid, and an equally valid part of nature as all the others, and sometimes a very useful one. For instance, right now, I think we must frame what's happening in Ukraine as a conflict, and we must help them to fight. That's a very appropriate application of this natural cultural tendency of human beings to frame certain things as a conflict. When you need to defend yourself against an attacker, you must frame it as a conflict and act accordingly. In other situations, framing everything as a conflict doesn't help, like fighting your cancer, like we talked about before. But because the Anglo-Saxon culture has come to dominate academia, even analytic philosophy is the Anglo-Saxon take on philosophy. Science is largely Anglo-Saxon, even though it started with Galileo. After Newton, it's a largely Anglo-Saxon enterprise. Now the whole world tends to frame everything as a conflict, even in the East. This is a phase. It will pass. There will be other potentialities of the human mind expressed in culture that will become stronger going forward, and this will become weaker, and then yet something else later on. The question is, can we survive? How long can we survive this? That's the only important question. But I wouldn't go down that road, Andrew, of making everything a personal problem and therefore trying to find a personal solution to every personal problem.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense to me, Bernardo. I mean,
And this
just
was a disclaimer. I didn't answer your question, and I forgot what the question was now. Sorry. Can you?
oh, where were we? Oh, yeah, the question was the viability of using healthy reductionism to reduce the meta-crisis to its irreducible component as a fundamental fracture. Basically, in my language, would be the primordial fracture is the very self-sense, is what you're talking about here, the fracturing of reality into self. Another duality, and then from that primordial rip, then comes rip upon rip, lie upon lie. We live in a world of fake news, lie upon lie fracture. So the question was, and I do think it's an important one, if in fact we can recursively create the meta-crisis by the reiteration of this pathological fracture, can we in fact heal it by progressive remembrances, healings, holings?
So that's why I made the disclaimer. I don't know to what extent we are the makers of the crisis or the subjects of the crisis. Um, because underlying the ego, there is what you call the unconscious mind. Jung called it as well. So did Freud. I don't think it's unconscious at all, but according to their definition of consciousness, which is what we would call associated meta-consciousness, according to that definition, it is the unconscious mind. The vast majority of our mental states are so-called unconscious. In other words, not associatively accessible from the ego at the metacognitive level. And those states are largely impersonal. Those states, even though they are us, they are not preoccupied with whether you have a plate of food in front of you tomorrow and a roof over your head, or whether you are realizing your fantasies of money and power. It's a part of mind that is a very natural, spontaneous, instinctive mind, and it's not preoccupied with these narratives of egoic consciousness. To what extent can we control them? I don't think we can control those layers of our own minds. Can we influence them? Yes. And I think we are morally obliged to try to exert that influence. But there is also a possibility, and that goes to Hegel's theory of history, that what we are experiencing, what we are going through, is a process that is much bigger than any individual mind. It's even bigger than individuality itself. It's the dialectic of history, in which the sum total of what we call the human mind tries to turn over every rock to identify all of its immanent potentials and express them. And it does that through that dialectics. First, a statement, a belief, a way of life, and then a confrontation with the antithesis of that, the other guys, the other way, capitalism versus communism, whites versus blacks, all these invented boundaries that we come up with. And then from that confrontation comes a new synthesis, one level higher in the spiral of these dialectics. And that new synthesis leads to a new antithesis, which then come together in another meta-meta synthesis. So to the extent that the meta-crisis is an expression of this broad dialectic process, we may not be able to stop it. We have to ride the wave. We are on that boat. The boat is carried by the currents of the unconscious, which are transpersonal, hardly controllable by the ego. And all we have to make sure of is that we don't capsize, but we have to ride the wave? Do we have the moral responsibility to do the best we can to avoid the destruction of ourselves and the planet? I mean, the planet will never be destroyed. Give it 1,000,000 years, it's all back up again. It's we who are going to be destroyed. Do we have the moral responsibility to try to prevent that so we are still around for the next synthesis so the process can go on? Yes, but I would guard against the implicit assumption that that the process is under our control.
Yeah, that's I guess again is so rich. One thing that comes to mind here, Bernardo, again, kind of tying back into what we were speaking about earlier, the symbolic nature of thing. When we're talking about cancer, one way I look on cancer is growth without direction. And so if you look at what's happening on a worldwide level, is it in fact, again, facile to say that we are, in fact, as a society culture, are acting as a type of cultural cancer, growth without direction. And in fact, we may be excised, right? We may be surgically removed by whatever. That already seems to be happening. So I wanted to bring that back into the picture to see if it lands with you. And maybe let me just pause on that for just a second, because the next topic I want to go to is leading into something we've been circumambulating that I really want to discuss at some depth. But is that too convenient, too facile to play with these levels of interpretation? Is that in fact an imputation of meaning, or is it in fact a extraction of meaning?
The part where you said we could excise ourselves.
Well, that growth with cancer is growth without direction. We have this crazy materialistic, capitalistic, consumeristic approach. The average,
Oh,
we're
oh, yeah.
without direction, and that's a type of cancer. And in fact, will nature excise us? Like you said, the planet will heal. We're not going to destroy the planet, but we certainly can destroy civilization.
That it is analogous to cancer is without a doubt. It's uh,
Yeah.
it's very obvious. Even if you look at the pattern with which cities grow, it looks like metastasis. Large tumors spring out, smaller tumors, the suburbs, which then grow and start sprouting out even other little tumors, and that we grow focused on only our own well-being and not the global dynamic plan or the dynamic balance of the planet that's cancer-like. Obviously, it is. It's very, very cancer-like. I think the analogy is perfect and obvious, undeniable, not polemical at all. And it's a gamble by nature because even other animals that have, for at least we have plenty of evidence to suggest that even other animals that have high level mental functions, like pachyderms or elephants, like cetaceans, like dolphins and whales, even some mollusks, like other higher primates, they have higher level mental functions. They can use tools. Crows can go through three levels of indirection to solve a problem. They can build a tool that allows them to unlock another tool that allows them to get the seed they want. So this is phenomenal. We do not have the exclusivity in having higher level mental functions, but there is something that sets us apart in nature, which is because we are highly metacognitive and symbolic thinkers, we unplugged from the web of instinct.
Yeah.
And and that gives us our power because now we are not subject to the checks and balances that are implicit in the web of instinct, which maintains the equilibrium of the planetary system. That's why we pollute, we pillage, we destroy, we dump. We are not in that web of instinct. That gives us our power, but it also makes us, turns us into a very, very great danger for nature as it expresses itself in this planet. So it's an enormous natural gamble. And how it happened, we do not know. It's one of the greatest mysteries of paleoanthropology. We know we have been anatomically what we are today for about 200,000 or 300,000 years, which is the blink of an eye ago, but still 200,000 or 300,000 years anatomically. Same sort of skeletal features, brain size, If anything, our brain size is a little smaller than Neanderthals, which are not really our ancestors, but we inbred with them. So all of us have Neanderthals. I have quite a bit of Neanderthal. Um, so we have been like that for 200 or 300,000 years, but evidence for symbolic thinking, which is what sort of allows us to disconnect from the web of nature, the web of instinct. Evidence for symbolic thinking goes back 30, maybe 50,000 years. Now, how did this happen? How can an animal that is anatomically whatever it had already been for 150 or 250,000 years suddenly express a unique potential that you don't find anywhere in nature without any anatomical change? Because what this suggests, and there's a wonderful book by Ian Tattersall called The Masters of the Planet. Ian Tattersall was the curator of the Hall of Human History in the American Museum of Natural History. So in that book, he says, whatever genetic mutations have enabled this ability to think symbolically, it was with us for 150 or 250,000 years already, but it went unexpressed, meaning that it was not affixed in our genome because of any fitness reasons. Otherwise, it would be expressed, because what is not expressed doesn't play a role in fitness. So we acquired that mutation for no good reason, no fitness reason whatsoever. It remained latent for reasons we do not understand. And then all of a sudden, 30 or 50,000 years ago, boom, we started expressing it. And it's not like an accident, like, oh, it's you happen to have a smaller year. There is no fitness purpose for that, no fitness reason for that, but it's one of those random fluctuations of evolution. No, no, no. This is the most significant mutation in the history of life, the mutation that unplugs a species from the web of instinct and allows us to develop language, abstract thinking, technology, science, go to the moon, and so forth. It's an extraordinary mutation, and it happened, insofar as we know, for no reason, no fitness reason. So this is astonishing. And to think that we understand what's going on this planet is vastly naive and arrogant. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because your questions suggest that we are responsible for the whole business. We don't know that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. We don't know that. Our moral responsibility applies to the extent that we can modulate this process. Insofar as we can modulate this process, we should apply our moral discernment to modulate it in a functional way, not a dysfunctional way. In other words, pollute less, thrash less, heat it up less, destroy less, kill less. That responsibility we have, but I wouldn't extrapolate that line of reasoning towards the assumption that if we apply our moral responsibilities correctly, we can change the whole dynamics, we can solve all of the problems and fit the entire planet under the image that we consider ideal. I wouldn't extrapolate that far. We don't really know what's going on. We think we are the masters of the planet, but the jury is still out on that one. We do not know all the organizing principles immanent in nature that have brought us to where we are. And I think to maintain a certain humble attitude towards nature is very important.
Yeah, it's what Francesco Varela talked about beautifully as the power of the open question. You know, being willing to just reside in liminal states, ambiguities, and keep the beginner's mind, the receptive mind, so that we don't have the hubris to realize we can fundamentally explain everything. I think this is largely, like we talked about last time, a developmental issue, that this is an egoic strategy. But let me share with you one thing here, Bernardo, that I really want to run with, that seeded this question about the meta-crisis. And this has to do with the type of practice that will lead us, I think, in some interesting directions. that has been in the historical traditions for a number of years. You'll find it in ancient Greece. You'll find it in South American cultures. You'll find it deeply in Tibetan traditions, which is where I roll in mostly. And this is a practice of complete utter sensory deprivation called dark retreat practice. And I want to say just a tiny bit about it because I've been doing this, studying this for 28 years. I've been doing it quite concertedly for almost a dozen years, going into quite extended periods of time with complete utter sensory deprivation. And it's quite compelling to say the least. It's as if you can re-educate your sense faculties. It's as if you go into this temporary voluntary blindness to learn quite literally how to see in a new way. And so the reason I mentioned this is one of the things that came to me in one of my recent practices was, and this was kind of initiated by some commentaries. There's a retreat center called Sky Cave in Oregon where people are going in now, celebrities, big shots are going in. So it's really taking off. And videotapes, hundreds of videotapes of people coming out just 3 days in the dark and having these profound healings and I mean, just incredible cures, things that take place when they're fundamentally, Bernardo, they're just in there. I mean, they're literally just doing nothing. And I started looking for possible models. In fact, I'm working with a number of scientists, Harvard, Stanford, all over the place. We're going to go in there. We're going to start to study what the transformative efficacy, like what is going on here? Why is this so compelling? Why is it so transformative? So the question I asked you earlier was seeded by the following. I see that, okay, we have all these people going in, they're coming out, so many people, all these different types of healing are taking place. They're all doing the same thing, which is nothing. How can that be healing? So here's the image that came to mind is that in a certain real way, dark retreat, it puts a cast on your mind. And so when you have two broken parts, you go see your orthopedic surgeon, they approximate the fractured aspects, they put it in the cast, and obviously then the healing remembrance take place. And so I was wondering if in fact, if people are indeed returning to the reduction base, being forced into a kind of a death space where they're unable to move, they're unable to dissociate on one level, their sense faculties are completely interrupted, and it's considered a wrathful, forceful method of liberation because in a certain way it almost forces this type of healing / holding that comes about. And so I asked this for a number of reasons. One thing that really came to me in my last one, I relate to darkness as my languaging, the color of non-duality. It breaks down inside and outside. It breaks down day and night. And what happened last time that I want to talk to you about is the breakdown or the dissolution of the boundary between the so-called conscious and unconscious mind, which to me resulted in an absolute torrent of creativity. I mean, I've been writing it for 5 months. It's just like unbelievable. And so then I clicked on what you said, and this is what I want to ask you more about, is that the unconscious mind, as you so elegantly write, is more accurately talked about as the obfuscated mind. And so to me, when I was in the dark, it was like, well, wait a second, what's the principal source of obfuscation? Well, ironically, light, right? In this sense, light doesn't reveal, light conceals. And so if I take away the principal source of obfuscation, the boundary between the unconscious and the unconscious mind relaxes, opens, becomes more porous, breaks down, resulting in an extraordinary stream of creativity. And I want to come back later, talk about like the sedimentation levels of the unconscious mind, what actually can bring about these varieties of experiences. So the issue for you, long-winded preparatory statement, because it's going to tie into something I want to ask you again in a second, is looking at the unconscious mind as, in fact, the obfuscated mind, number one, and then looking at the other source of obfuscation being metacognition itself. That this great gift that we're talking about, you're just saying 30,000 years ago, this amazing, maybe just for the sport of it all, right? Maybe just for Leela, as they say in Hindu, just for the play of it all, metacognition arose. And you talked so beautifully about metacognition as a source of obfuscation itself. So two things there, the relationship of the conscious to the obfuscated so-called unconscious mind, and then metacognition as a source of obfuscation.
Yeah, so I see in principle dissociation and did you finish your question?
Yes. Oh yeah. I got to stop sometime, otherwise I'm going to suck out all the air in the room.
No, if you had the question to conclude.
I have more to say about it, but I want to talk about it in a different track after we talk about this light obfuscation thing.
Yeah. So I think it, at least to start with, it is useful to think of dissociation as separate from the obfuscation of metaconsciousness. What is
Mhm.
dissociation? Two mental states are dissociated when you cannot reach the other, when you start from the first through a chain of inferences. So you have two mental states, A and B. A is a thought, B is an emotion. Um, if you can start from A and through a chain of associations or inferences get to B, then you are associated. But if you can't do that, if there is no path that starts from A and arrives at B through a chain of cognitive associations, then A and B are dissociated. Now, dissociation prevents the ego from accessing certain mental states that may be part of us as individuals or may be part of nature at large. Um, Obfuscation is different. Obfuscation is when, by laying your attention on a subset of your mental states, you increase the intensity, the mental energy of their experiencing so much that all the other mental states that you are experiencing do not rise to a metacognitive level. They become obfuscated. It's like the stars at noon in a clear day. They are all still up in the sky. Their photons are all still hitting your retina. But because of the blue glare of sunlight diffraction in the atmosphere, we don't register the stars, even though we are seeing them. Their photons are hitting our retina. So the same thing for this mechanism of attention. When we attend to a certain subset of mental states, the others get dissociated. My girlfriend knows this very well because if I'm writing and she says something to me, well, I don't hear. She has to come and knock me and say, "I'm talking to you." um, Ultimately, I'm not sure there is really a fundamental difference between dissociation and this obfuscation of attention. There may be, there may not be. I don't want to get into that because this is still stuff, that is not settled in my mind, and I don't like to talk about things that are not settled in my mind. I may regret saying certain things, but in principle, they are different. Now, if you get into a sensory deprivation chamber for healing purposes, not creative purposes, healing purposes, I think it is a well-known fact that mind, if given the opportunity, heals itself.
Yeah.
It has internal, implicit, intrinsic healing mechanisms. And that's why we need to sleep and dream at night. That's for mind to heal itself, correct its imbalances, and find its center again. Today, we hardly sleep because of coffee, television, mobile phones, light, and stress, productivity stress. We sleep maybe 5-6 hours on average of very poor quality sleep. So we don't give mind opportunity to direct its own mental energy towards its own healing, because that mental energy is always being dragged outwards to the phone, to the social media, to the lights in the room, to the television program, to the problems of work that you keep on thinking about when you go to bed. Um, but if you are locked inside a sensory deprivation chamber for 3 days and you see, hear, taste, smell, and feel nothing, only when you have to eat, uh, then you are forcing mind to let go of this outward oriented processing and spare its own energies for its natural healing. In other words, healing is that which will always happen unless you're busy with something else. I think that's how nature works, which doesn't mean that you can live to 120 if you live inside a sensory deprivation chamber, because uh, sometimes the end of a dissociation is the reflection of a healthy mind. I don't know whether you want to explore this territory. It's territory, and I am now ready to talk about
Oh, no,
because I'm writing about it.
totally far away, whatever comes to heart. I mean, this is also super interesting to me in relation, because the other thing I have a deep passion for is how all this relates, in fact, to death,
Yeah.
the dream
So
at the
just
end.
so I'll come back to this just to
Okay.
complete my answer. So that's
Okay.
healing. The other thing is creativity, and
Yeah.
that has to do with what you so well articulated in your question, which is there are mental states that seem to be beyond us because they are either dissociated or obfuscated. But if you reduce the dissociation, if you reduce the obfuscation, now you can grasp certain ideas, certain thoughts, certain creative impulses that were around all the time, but unreachable through logic associations, or unperceivable because of obfuscation, just like the stars at noon. And then that can heighten creativity, yes. So I see the benefit both for healing and creativity, but because of different mechanisms. For healing, because it allows mind to mobilize its energies towards its natural healing, and for creativity, because it lowers the boundaries of the dissociation, lowers the boundaries of the obfuscation a little bit. It's like a solar eclipse that allows you to see the stars at noon. Now, going back to the point you wanted me to, I'll briefly introduce the point, and then I'll give you the opportunity to either pursue it or let it sit. But we have this tendency to think that a healthy individual is an individual that lives very long. I think there is no good reason to think that. Maybe there isn't good reason to think that the opposite is true either. I'm just saying it's arbitrary. It's a projection of our ego, because the ego wants to live forever. But the nature is not about the ego. The natural history of apple trees is not that individual apple blossom who wants to live forever. So we don't know what nature is busy doing. We only know we are part of it. Nature expresses itself through us. We are nature. There is nothing more to us than nature. We are nature in the process of expressing itself. And we developed an ego because we need to know to which mouth to bring the fork. But that ego then tries to take over, which is a sort of an artifact of what nature is doing. And it convinces itself that healthiness or health means to live as long as possible. And I think that is completely arbitrary. I will even go further. This is an insight I had more or less recently. No, Bernardo Kastrup, I'll make a confession to you. People don't know it, but I have known it all my life. Bernardo Kastrup is a kid who wants to design and play with computers. That's the sum total of the story. He's a kid who is in love with his girlfriend and just wants to design and play with computers. That's it. There is nothing beyond it. Everything else is a strange, comes out of a strange stream of insight and intuition and a strange feeling of responsibility. And I call it the diamond, this impersonal force of nature, because there are certain things that nature wants to do through me, which don't care about the kid who wants to play with computers. So I realized that this thing that nature is trying to do through me, which is a philosopher, right? Bernardo Kastrup is not a philosopher. I mean, in a sense, he was always a philosopher because he always asked the great questions. But a public intellectual, that's not Bernardo Kastrup. If you ask me, do I like to write books? No, I never did. I always had to write books. Otherwise, my life would become absolutely unbearable. I would be seized by all kinds of neuroses, even physical health issues. So I write because I must, because I have this irresistible sense that drags me or kicks me from the butt and forces me to do it. But it's not who Bernardo Kastrup, the kid, it's not what he wants to do. It's not what he enjoys. I'm writing another book now, and there are days I wake up 3:30 in the morning and I have to write, and I absolutely hate it, but I have to. Or there are days like I just wanted to sit in the garden a little longer and have a beer, but and I have to write. I experience it as a heavy duty, not something I spontaneously really want to do myself. Just a sort of a wave, impersonal wave that comes from the root of nature and comes over up my chest, and I just need to sort of vomit. And maybe I give words to it, but not to the ideas. So I realized, and that's the insight, I realized that for nature to finish doing what it wants to do through me, to actually succeed in that, for this job to finally be completed, the absolutely necessary, indispensable final step that crowns the work is for me to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
It cannot be achieved without that. Because for as long as I am alive, I am a farting, sweating, stinky human being full of character flaws, shadow impulses, but when you die, now you are sort of enveloped in the glow of the ancestors. And now nature succeeded. Because what nature wants is that image in the mind of everybody else. And that image is not complete. It is not released to its full potential until one dies. Philosophers are not philosophers until they are dead. While Schopenhauer, or no, just think of my great philosophers, Schopenhauer and Jung, who I consider a philosopher. If Schopenhauer were alive, what we would think of him is a supremely arrogant human being, a misogynist who hated his own mother. And he was so unbearable because of his arrogance that he lived alone in a guest house with poodle dogs. But he's dead. So he's Arthur Schopenhauer, the man who pointed the way forward, the man who overcome the limitations that Kant couldn't. He's now an ancestor. He's a magical idea now in the collective mind. That's what nature succeeded in doing through him, but nature could only do that after he was dead. At least nature gave him a wonderful death. He had no known health issue. He was having breakfast in his guest house, and he just died while having breakfast. It didn't even fall off his chair. He just switched off. Let me give you another recent example. Steve Jobs,
Oh, yeah.
the visionary, the magical visionary who improved our lives tremendously, who pointed the way forward for the whole internet, for communications, who indirectly solved so many problems because of what he enabled, the life he enabled us to have. But if you were alive and you were living with him, you would know that he was an abusive bully who eschewed his own daughter for years. He was not a pleasant person. Death elevates. Death allows nature to, think of forging a piece of metal in a certain shape. Think of forging it in a mold of sand. When the forging process is finished, you have to take that piece of metal out of the sand and then give it a knock and shake it to liberate the sand and then polish it a little bit. In other words, you have to filter out the impurities that come with the process of forging. Those impurities are character flaws, biological necessities. When nature finishes forging that thing that it wants to forge, that thing that will be imprinted in the crystal of eternity, it needs to clean it off. It needs to clean off the sand, clean off the character flaws, clean off the need to eke out an existence and biological necessities like farting and pooping and eating and pissing and all that stuff. It needs to filter all that out. And how does it succeed in doing that? By us dying. We absolutely have to die. Anybody who promotes ideas as opposed to making things, and Steve Jobs, make no mistake, he was a promoter of ideas. He had an aesthetical vision. It was much beyond mere devices. Devices were just the carriers of that daimonic vision. We all have to die. So that's the thought I wanted to share with you, that the idea of a healthy life as a life that lasts very long, I don't think it's very well informed by the subtleties and nuances of nature. I think if we really pay attention, we realize that a healthy life is one that ends at the right time, in just the right way.
Yeah.
That is the healthy life.
Again, Bernardo, there's just so much here. It's like crazy. So a couple of things. One is the intimation in what you just said, and also in a number of your books that if it's there in an overt manner, I have not come across it. And these are discussions about spectrums of identity and developmental structures. You seem to be suggesting that there's my languaging, but we exist on at least two, if not three, vectors of identity, and we're like oscillating. It's just the most amazing thing. We're actually taking birth moment to moment like a chameleon, depending on the dictates of the environment. And basically a self-sense is brought to birth and a new identity moment to moment. And so on one level, what I'm hearing from you is my languaging. There's this ultraviolet, selfless, dare we say, more evolved aspect in the spectrum of identity of Bernardo that wants to actually doesn't have a choice, but to surrender to the voice of the diamond, to act as a representative of reality and be sounds cliche, but be a servant of peace. On the other end, you still have the devolutionary tail that wags the dog. There's the child or whatever. And so I think this is very helpful to understand because it helps us, it gives explanatory power to conflicts of interest, to the way we can manifest in all these different ways. And so I'm wondering, and this also relates, by the way, to the question I was going to get to a little bit later about sedimentation levels in the unconscious mind. I so appreciate what Carl Jung did, his description of psyche, unconscious, and collective unconscious. But I think there's more granularity. The wisdom traditions can be much more articulate, specific about different levels of dimension of the unconscious obfuscated mind. And I say this because this has been a large part of my personal journey when I go into the dark, is literally the mind falls into itself, wrong bop in Tibetan. And as it falls in, it falls away from these limited, constipated, egoic dimensions. And as Rumi put it, into larger rings of being, larger dimensions of identity, until, of course, in a very real way, I die in retreat. It's like a coffin. And so I, in fact, can have this experience of the complete dissolution of the self-sense. That's one aspect of what happens when non-duality is broken down. So that's one thing. We've tossed this term ego around a lot. I like the definition of ego as an arrested form of development that's necessary. And then as we grow using Hegelian terms, we transcend but include the ego so that we can still communicate with those who are operative in that particular frequency domain. And then I want to say, God, there's so much here. And then, well, let me pause there because the other two questions are about what happens when the contents of mind spill into mind at large when we die. That's something super interesting that you share that is a little bit unclear to me, but I don't want to conflate that with what I want to talk to you about here. Is the role of structuralism, developmental bandwidths, integral approaches to working with identity?
I think the only true ontologically real identity, the only identity that isn't just a narrative within mind, is what philosophers call core subjectivity. Schopenhauer referred to it as the one I in the sense of what we see. In English, it's a nice pun between I and the I of the self, but he wrote in German, and the word he used was the word for I, E-Y-E. He referred to what we call core subjectivity today as the one eye of the world that looks out from every creature. That's core subjectivity, because the eye that sees is not the contents of vision. In other words, the subjectivity is not the experiences it experiences. It is the experiencer. So I think the experiencer, core subjectivity, is the only ontologically real identity that there is. And it's the same in you, in me, and everybody else, because if we take out our memories, our perceptions that are anchored in a particular space-time location, if we take out all of those mental contents and we leave out only core subjectivity, then my core subjectivity is the same core subjectivity in you, not another copy of. It is the same thing, not another unit of, not another unit of the same model. No, it's the same thing, because even time and space fall out in that case. And therefore, the fact that you occupy a different point in space-time from me doesn't constitute a difference anymore, because that difference is itself one of the contents of core subjectivity, not the framework wherein core subjectivity exists. That's an idea that goes back to Kant and Schopenhauer. Space-time are just modes of perception, not an objective scaffolding of the world. So from that perspective, all the other identities are just narratives that change over time. You know, I did an exercise with myself. I'm not really a spiritual guy, so I don't have a spiritual practice other than to live life, which I think is the greatest spiritual practice there is. It's to live life. That's the Western yoga. Live life. Life teaches. Life is the guru. But I had this thought experiment that I did with myself. There was another person that I couldn't quite understand. I'm not going to name the person, but the person acted in ways that I couldn't quite figure out. And then I did this exercise. I thought, imagine that I am me, but I can look out from the eyes of that person as if I were in that other spatial location. This is easily imaginable as if you would put a virtual reality headset and the cameras in the forehead of the other person. Then you would see the world from his eyes. But now imagine that the technology is perfect. So you really see the world from the other person's eyes, but you're still yourself. Will you cease to be yourself because you are perceiving the world through somebody else's eyes? No. Now imagine that even your bodily sensations could be replaced. So you can feel the other person's stomach rumbling, or the other person's bellyache, or the painful zit in the other person's back. Would you stop being yourself just because you now can feel the other person's bodily sensations? No. Now imagine that you would dress like the other person, same clothes, not the same model of clothes, but the exact same clothes. Would you stop being the other person? No. Now imagine that in addition to your own memories, you can remember everything the other person remembers. Maybe Elon Musk's Neuralink came up with some device that allows you to remember the other person's memories in addition to your own. Would you stop being yourself? No, you would still have your own memories. You may be seeing the world from the other person's perspective. You may be remembering the other person's memories, but you still know who you are. You're still yourself. Now imagine that in addition to all this, now you forgot your memories. Who would you be now?
Beautiful.
What is the thing that remains the same? It's core subjectivity. Even if you forgot your own memories and you only remember the other person's memories and you're seeing the world from the other person's eyes, you're still you. Nothing changed. Only the experience is changed. Perception is anchored in a different spatial temporal location. The memories that are experienced are now different. It's just data. But you're still you, except that if asked, you would now say, with absolute sincerity, I am the other person. Because you see through their eyes and you remember their memories. You would say, I am him, while you never stopped being what you were when we began this whole exercise. That never changed. But you will swear now that you are the other person, and you will think when the other person dies, I'm dead, I'm toast. That's our dilemma. Yeah. That is the confusion of these hierarchies of narratives, these hierarchies of identification. It's not very, it got to a point that it's not very healthy. We need to know to which mouth to bring the fork. Not only that, we need an ego that is strong enough to have ethical and moral discernment. But when we mistake that tool, that ego, for an identity, now we are off to the races. God help us.
And once again, it's this notion of amnesia. It's just forgetfulness. And the practice, the anamnesis, the practice really is one of recollection, remembrance. So I think that's also spot on. So this is so rich. You know, the Buddhist tradition talks about this core subjectivity, literally the changeless nature, or in Tibetan, machik batigle, the indestructible continuum, the same foundational core subjectivity that we all have that like sprouts in a massive aspen grove, you know, the largest, arguably the largest living organism in the world. All these sprouts arise from the same underlying matrix of reality, and it's just a matter of amnesia, forgetfulness of who we truly are. But along these lines, there's just so much here. The healthy mind and death, and what you write about, this is still not clear to me, that is so compelling about this notion of death kind of a level of completion. You talk about the kind of, using my languaging, and please correct me if I'm wrong with paraphrasing what you say, is the kind of the contribution of our individual mind stream back into mind at large as we die. That as we die, the contents of our being are not lost. As the whirlpool dissolves back into the stream, the contents of the whirlpool contribute to the stream. So if that is in fact true, I find it a really compelling, provocative statement. How do we reconcile, maybe that isn't even the right word, the great contributions of an Einstein or the great artists, the poets, versus the lower center of gravity, which is the greater populace, the Hitlers, the Putins in extreme forms, and what happens when they die and they, so to speak, contribute to mind at large. So talk to me a little bit more about that, because it's such a compelling way to look at the end of life and the way that our particular contribution as a sentient being either merit or demeritorious in terms of how we contribute to mind at large when we dissolve back into the stream.
Under analytic idealism, the body, including the patterns of brain activity that correlate so well with particular inner experiences, all of that, all of our metabolism, our anatomy, the entire organism, the entire body, is what a dissociative process in the mind of nature looks like. In other words, the body is not what creates the mind. The body is what a particular mental state looks like, a dissociative state. And that's why brain activity, patterns of brain activity correlate so well with inner experience, because that brain activity is what the inner experience looks like when observed from the outside. In other words, when observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. So under analytic idealism, death is the end of the dissociation, not the end of consciousness or the end of mind. I use the words interchangeably. Life is what a dissociative process in the broader mind of nature looks like. And that's why we have this sense of individual identity, because we cannot access mental states beyond us. There is a dissociative boundary in between. Death then would be the end of that dissociative boundary, would be the reintegration of our mental states with the broader cognitive environment surrounding us. So our mental states are now accessible to nature at large, accessible to mind at large. They are not corralled within the small boundaries of a particular dissociative process that corresponds to a living organism. So your insights, your learnings, they are released into the broader cognitive context of nature. That's probably, I speculate about this, I know it's speculative, but that's probably the intuition that underlies the notion of sacrifice. Why do we think that the gods benefit from our killing an animal or killing a person? Why? I think the underlying intuition is that because life is a dissociation, whatever the mental contents of a living being are, for as long as the dissociation lasts, are not accessible from the outside, because the dissociative boundary works both ways. We can't access the outside, and the outside cannot access our inner states. So by killing, you make those inner states available to nature at large, to the gods. This is, of course, misinformed. We are all going to die anyway. Rushing the process only caps the opportunities nature has to achieve whatever it's trying to achieve through us. We are all going to die anyway. There's no need to rush the process by committing sacrifice. But the underlying intuition seems to be there. Another symbolic manifestation of this underlying intuition is the figure of the Grim Reaper.
Oh, yeah.
The Grim Reaper carries an instrument.
Harvest. Yeah.
It's a harvesting instrument. It could have been anything, a stick, a knife, a stone to throw on your head. And now it could have been anything, fire to burn you, anything. But it's a harvesting instrument. What is it that is being harvested? What is it that nature is banking on when you die? Well, it's our inner state. Now, there is more nuance to this, because one could say, Bernardo, if brain activity is what our inner states look like, and memories are our inner states, then the end of brain activity, in other words, death, is the end of memories as well, because their appearance disappears. So the thing that appears should also disappear, just like the dissociation disappears. This is an entirely coherent, logical, and valid statement. But there is an empirical answer to this, which is despite trying and spending billions of dollars, we have never found memories in the brain. Despite sensationalist claims to the contrary from university press releases, when you actually read the research, it's nowhere near having found memories in the brain. On the contrary, there was research done decades ago. People trained rats to navigate a complex maze to find food, and then they started slicing off pieces of the rat's brain, not the motor sensory area, otherwise the mouse cannot walk or see, but slicing everything else off. And they sliced almost 90% of the brain, if I remember that old research correctly, and the rat still remembers how to navigate the maze. So you didn't slice off the memories. And then if you slice off more, then you'd kill the rat, or the rat couldn't move. So you couldn't continue the experiment, but almost 90%. And then 10 years ago, 11 years ago, research done by Michael Levin's group at Tufts University, they published an article in which they took planaria. Planaria are little aquatic flatworms. They have a small brain that is fully in their heads. They have a very recognizable triangular head and then one long tail. And their entire nervous system is in the head. The whole thing. It's not a vertebrate organism. So there are no neurons anywhere else. They would train the planaria to navigate an aquatic maze to find food. Took weeks, but the planaria learned. Now, the planaria have a unique feature. If you slice them in two, both sides regenerate into two new planaria. The head grows a body, and the body grows a new head. So you can make them reproduce by cutting them in half. And you have to wait 2 weeks until they regrow the part. So they took the trained planaria and decapitated them all, removed all their neurons, and waited 2 weeks for those planaria to grow new heads, brand new neurons. And the planaria remembered how to navigate the maze. So what research is showing is that active mental states, thoughts, emotions, things anchored in the present moment, they appear in the body image. They appear in the form of nervous system states, patterns of brain activity. But memories don't seem to be part of it. You can't find the memories. Memories are something related to the past, not anchored in the present. You can't find them there. You can find motor skills. You can find specific experiences that we are having in the moment. If you recall a memory, then your experience of that memory is in brain activity. But where the information comes from for the brain to know how to reconstitute that experience, that we don't know. It doesn't seem to be in the brain. So that's why I draw that empirically informed line and I say, since memories are not reflected in the body image, the end of the body image does not mean the end of memories. But since we know that the dissociation is reflected in the body image, you take psychedelics, you impair brain activity, which goes down, you're less dissociated, you trip far out across the universe. The dissociation is anchored, is present in the image that we call the body. Death is the end of the image, it's the end of the dissociation, but not necessarily the end of all of your hard-earned insights in the course of your life, which one has accumulated at the cost of great suffering. And that's why life, the end of life, I think, is the ultimate sacrifice. It is the harvesting of nature. Those memories are not correlated to spatial-temporal location, but they are probably still contained within the dissociative boundary, even though they don't appear in the appearance. And death is the releasing of those insights into the broader mind of nature, which maybe learns through us. Maybe life is sacrificial in that sense, which is an intuition Jung already had. Jung said life is sacrificial. Life is meant to inform God with the light of consciousness.
There's so much, really, every time you hit one of your riffs, there's like we could do 2 hours just on the riff. I mean, a couple of things that come to mind here, of course, are Rupert Sheldrake's notions of morphogenetic fields, which is an interesting thing to interject here. But a couple of things here, the notion of harvesting and the like. So when Hitler dies, this is like bad crop, right? This is like bad harvesting. So,
No.
but let me ask you this, and then yeah, I'd like to have you run with this. How does, in fact, this affect slash contribute maybe an anthropomorphic world, but how does this dissolution of mental content memory into mind at large affect mind at large? And therefore, how does it also potentially affect us left behind? And the thing that is absolutely inextricably woven in here that we haven't talked about at all is karmic theory. How does that play out at all? Is that too metaphysical for what you're talking about here? Because in Eastern thought, as you know, karmic theory is a colossal infrastructure, a binding factor in these wisdom traditions and there's a very quite sophisticated phenomenology, ontology about how this process takes place. A little bit of it from the Yogacara tradition. They're coming back to the image of the whirlpool. When the whirlpool dissolves, it, so to speak, contributes to mind at large. But according to karmic theory, then through habit patterns, another way to talk about karmic theory is the power of habit. And habit is a type of memory, and that's all connected to these fields again. So the whirlpool then reconstitutes farther down the road based on these particular predispositions and proclivities. So I know I'm throwing a number of things up here, but it's still not clear to me how this dissolution affects mind at large, positively or negatively. And then if there is a place in your worldview for karmic theory, in terms of explaining the reconstituting process and so-called rebirth.
Yeah. I don't think mind at large is metacognitive, deliberate, and has the higher level mental functions that we have. Because otherwise, every living being would have this higher level mental functions from the get-go. These higher level mental functions would be interwoven in the very fabric of nature, and your amoeba swimming in your toilet could write the Encyclopedia Britannica, or meditate or ponder very abstract thoughts. I don't think it is. I think metacognition, deliberation, self-awareness, higher level mental functions, they emerged because of 4 billion years of very costly evolution in this planet, costing a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, literally. So I don't think mind at large out there, nature out there beyond us, is self-reflective, like an anthropomorphized God that has a plan, anticipated everything that's going on. I don't think that's what's happening. I think nature, beyond the minds of highly evolved creatures, is fundamentally instinctive. It does what it does because it is what it is, not because it has pondered the situation in a self-aware manner with a lot of self-reflection and concluded on a certain course of action. I think nature reacts, doesn't deliberate. I think nature reacts spontaneously, instinctively. And therefore, a Hitler is a spontaneous mental complex that has a reason in nature because it was part of the possibilities. Everything that can happen in nature eventually does, until nature develops some form of self-awareness and ability to deliberate, in which case it can make choices about what not to do to itself. Because at the end of the day, all these individuals that cause suffering and undergo suffering, it's the mind of nature. It's nature doing this to itself. So maybe nature one day, which I think it's not even conceivable right now, but maybe one day nature as a whole will develop some sort of self-awareness, just like monkeys developed self-awareness on this planet after 4 billion years. Maybe that will happen in some grand total scheme of things at some point, at which point nature can now choose. I'm not going to do a Hitler because I'm not going to do that to myself. But we are not there. So for as long as we are not there, nature is collecting every point of view from each of our lives. So the memories of a Hitler go to nature, and the memories of the 6 million Jews he murdered go to nature too. And now nature has both perspectives. And that is an enrichment. Now you might say morally, nature should have chosen to not have those 6 million perspectives. Yes, But I don't think nature is, is at that point. I don't think there is any empirical reason at all to think of the mental states out there in nature as deliberate and self-aware and thoughtful and, metacognitive, planned. There is no evidence for that. Nature always seems to react spontaneously, which we see because the laws of physics are so predictable and regular. Nature doesn't change its mind about whether the apple should fall down or fall up. It always falls down. That's characteristic of instinct. Crocodiles, if you approach them and you shorten your distance between you and them below a certain threshold, which I don't know what it is, but I know this threshold exists, then they will try to catch you. If you don't cross that threshold, they will not. They're predictable. They're like little machines, instinctive minds that follow predictable regularities. The rest of nature seems to act like crocodiles. The apple always falls down, it never falls up. So I think it's not even useful to speculate or conceive of a future state of nature in which nature itself make moral choices. At this point, I think moral responsibility lies squarely with us. We cannot excuse ourselves from this. We cannot pass how do you call it? Pass the buck?
Yeah,
They
pass the
say.
buck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We cannot pass the buck to God because God doesn't know what he's doing or what she's doing. God is instinctive. We are the metacognitive spies of God. That's our role. We have to be the ones that pass moral judgment. Nature itself is just collecting all the perspectives of everything it has done to itself through the eyes of all the creatures that have ever lived and died on this planet. I don't know whether this is a satisfying answer, but
Well,
the conclusion is moral responsibility is here with us. It's not out there. It's not written in 10 tablets of stone given by some god, metacognitive god sitting in a throne up in the clouds. No, the buck stops here. It's with us.
yeah. So again, there's God, it's like so much here. So this brings in notions of causality. Maybe we can venture into these waters in relation to synchronicity and the like, which is I think this is so bloody interesting. But a couple of things
Oh,
connected to
oh, oh, sorry, I forgot about karma.
exactly. That's what I was just going to say. What is the carrier? What is the vector, the carrier for this process, karma?
There is nothing, I'll try to answer this question as objectively as possible.
Okay.
There is nothing in analytic idealism that entails or implies a notion of personal karma, because the foremost hypothesis under analytic idealism is that personhood does not survive death. Consciousness does. The consciousness that dreams it's being a person does, but the personhood doesn't. A metaphor for that is a dream. When you wake up from a dream, a dream is a dissociative state. When you are dreaming, you think you are your dream avatar, but not the agency that is doing the rest of the dream. The other people, the cars, the trees, the houses. You think that's outside of you. You are dissociated from the part of your mind that is doing the rest of the dream. You think you are your dream avatar. When you wake up, your dream avatar is dead. That individuality that that is the consequence of a dissociative dream state, that personhood does not survive your waking up. But you survive. You were the thing doing the whole thing, the rest of the dream too. And you know that when you wake up. And that's why you don't mourn the death of your dream avatar. Same thing, I think, uh, in life. I think the foremost hypothesis is that because upon death, nothing of the body remains, only a sort of a footprint, like a fossil or an embalmed body. That's a footprint left behind. Nature was doing something that it's no longer doing, but what it did before leaves a footprint, which is the dead body, no longer metabolizing. Short of that, nothing remains. So I don't think personhood remains, even though personal memories, we have reason to believe they do, because they are not correlated apparently with brain activity or anything in a brain state. So how could there be a carrier of personal karma beyond the end of personhood? Now, it is coherent and conceivable to imagine that there is a hierarchy of dissociation, and that death, as we know it, it's only the end of the tip of that hierarchy,
Yeah.
and that we then fall back to a lower level of dissociation, which is still individual in a certain way. That is coherent, but there is no empirical evidence for this. I would like to see at least some cloud or some shadow of a dead person still detectable that could be the appearance, the dashboard representation of that individuality that remains. But that doesn't seem to be the case. When a body decomposes, it becomes the earth again. Everything is recycled back into the rest of the world, and nothing that is individual and separate from the rest of nature seems to survive, except for fossils, which are just footprints. Fossils are made of stone. They are not made of the atoms that were part of the fossilized creature. It's just that minerals have replaced the physical positions of the organic matter, such as to preserve the form, but nothing of the original organism has stayed behind. It has been completely recycled. So I don't think we have enough reasons under analytic idealism to speculate too much around the notion of personal karma. But if karma is interpreted as mental causality in general, then yes,
Yeah.
the whole of nature is a mental dance. So yeah, mental causation goes on and on, maybe not with a personal carrier. Now,
Yeah.
final disclaimer, Andrea, and then I'll go back to you. That doesn't mean that I'm right. It only means that analytic idealism, which has been derived based on reason and evidence alone, not introspection, analytic idealism doesn't give us enough reason to speculate around personal karma. But maybe there are people out there who have powers of introspection, spiritual people, I think you would call them, meditators, enlightened people. I'm very open to that possibility. I think there is a lot of evidence that these people exist. I'll share with you the most amazing piece of evidence I know of. It is entirely coherent to think that through introspection and not reason and evidence, they have achieved states in which it has become clear to them that in some way that I cannot make sense of, such thing as personal karma exists. And then I would bow to their wisdom over my own if they are reliable people. But out of pure reason and evidence, as reflected under analytic idealism, there is no objective reason to do that. Now, why do I believe that there are enlightened people? You know, around the time of the Vietnam War, there was a Buddhist monk.
Taekwondo.
Huh?
I interrupted you, but I think I know where you're going. Please continue. Sorry, I just get too excited.
The guy who self-immolated.
Yeah, Taekwondo.
Yeah,
It's stunning, huh?
he just sat down in a yoga position in the middle of the street, doused himself with an accelerant, set himself on fire, and was absolutely serene, meditating, no sign of this, no sign of movement, let alone despair, eyes closed, his body burning. For minutes, long minutes, he sat there like he was not feeling a thing, no pain, no suffering. And he only toppled over when he was carbonized, and what was left wasn't physically capable of sustaining its own weight, so he toppled over. That to me is proof writ large that such a thing as absolute control of the mind through introspection and reaching states that aren't personal is a reality. It is possible. Now, not that he self-immolated. Many people self-immolate, but the moment they set themselves on fire, they run desperately. You know, they are completely absorbed into the reality of that physical pain. He didn't. He didn't. He was impassive. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. So if you ask me, do I respect people who have been to these states that are completely beyond my abilities? Do I respect them for what they bring back in terms of a message? Yeah, absolutely respect them. I'm very ready to concede that they may be right and that reason and evidence just don't give us the complete picture, maybe not even the right picture.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I'm so glad you brought, John Kennedy said it's the most impactful photograph taken in history. And I have to agree. It's just incredibly powerful. And there's ways to actually describe phenomenologically where he might have gone in order to do that. But what I did want to say here suggests that I think is so wonderful on your part, Bernardo, is the recognition of the possible limitations of this. I like to think of it from our last conversation, this kind of cognitive punk on the block, right? Rationality and logic that came around 30,000 years ago, this arrogant little punk that came in and now feels it can overthrow hundreds of thousands of years of mythopoetic renderings of reality.
It's part of childhood. Childhood is
I
like
love that
this.
part of you. And so that's fantastic. And so maybe the intimation here is handing the baton off. Saint Bonaventure talked about this in terms of the three eyes: the eye of reason, the eye of flesh, the eye of reason, and the eye of contemplation, logic, spirituality, and then meditation altogether. And perhaps the baton needs to be handed off to a larger kind of context. But still, the question remains for me, and I want to just take this a tad bit further. The carrier for when the contents of mind dissolve, would you, in Jungian terms, they're poured back into the collective unconscious? Because when people are listening to this borders on real metaphysics in the pejorative sense. It's like, okay, what's the vector? What's the carrier for this? And so would you, in fact, associate that with a collective unconscious, or what is it that is the repository, therefore, of these habit patterns? In the Buddhist tradition, this is what's called the eighth consciousness, which actually goes a little bit below the collective unconscious, that kind of repository of habituation propensities, that as a form of momentum, metaphorically thinking, that is what continues this kind of wind, this momentum, this stream. So what's the carrier?
Look, we have to contend with what the evidence says. I would prefer that we found memories in the brain. It would make the story much neater, because then all experiences, whether they are episodic memories or present feelings and thoughts, they all have a representation on this dashboard we call perception. They all have a physical appearance. Physicality being what they look like as opposed to being what they are in and of themselves. So I would prefer that. But it doesn't seem to be the case. You know, the people who will disagree with me are researchers that want funding to do their memory research. And therefore, they will say, no, the jury's still out. We are still looking for it. We will find it one day. Well, you know, how many billions and how many decades are we going to spend on this? So I am too... I can't ignore the power of failure, because what I want to believe is something else. I don't have it in me. So we have come to a point now in the first quarter of the 21st century where it's like you really gotta believe to keep looking, because not only, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but we do have counter studies. Like the study done by Michael Levin. You cut off the brain, and new brain grows up, and the memory is still there. Michael did many other more sophisticated experiments. I don't know which ones he's already published, or look at his publications and even future publications. But this experiment has been confirmed in amazing ways. There's an experiment in which cells of an organism that learn to deal with a toxic compound. Those cells are brought back to a sort of a state where they can become any other cell, brought back to the primordial state, implanted in another organism. And then that other organism knows how to deal with that chemical compound. It's like, what the hell? These are not brain cells. These were not brain cells. If I remember correctly, they were epithelial cells, skin cells. So memories don't seem to be correlated with physical stuff, except for the fact that when you move one physical thing to another, memories seem to be carried along, even though they are not reflected physically in that which you moved. So you are causally impacting the dynamics of memory, but they seem to be immanent in the physical, not existing ontologically in the physical. They don't project a physical image, even though they are immanent there. So if I surrender to this, which I did, I can't help, there is a limit to my faith. And I no longer have the faith that we'll find memory. All the big announcements over the past 20 years that they found memory, when you read the studies, you go like, they found nothing. There's nothing akin to what we understand as memory there. It's almost unethical, these press releases that universities and research institutions are make to attract funding. There's nothing there. If I surrender to this, and I can't help but surrender to this, then to me, when I say memories go to the collective unconscious, what I'm saying is that what does the collective unconscious look like? Even according to Jung, and Jung is on record on this twice in his collected works. The collective unconscious looks to us like the inanimate world. That's what the collective unconscious looks like. Just like my personal consciousness looks like my physical body, the collective consciousness that we call the collective unconscious looks like the physical universe, because my body is made up of the same atoms and fields that constitute the rest of the universe. Matter is what mental processes look like. Inanimate matter is what non-dissociated mental processes look like. In other words, the collective unconscious. So in saying that memories go to the collective unconscious, I am not appealing to something that isn't concrete.
Mm.
On the contrary, I'm saying memories go into what appears to us as the physical inanimate world, the stars, the galaxies, the moons, the black holes, the quasars, all this good stuff. That's where they go. Now, since the physical world is an appearance of the thing in itself, not the thing in itself, this appearance may be incomplete. When you talk to me now, you're talking via Zoom, you see me on your computer screen, but what you're seeing is not me. What you're seeing is an appearance of me. That appearance is not complete. You cannot see what's in the back of my head, under my clothes. You cannot see the molecular details of my metabolism. Appearances correlate with the thing that appears, but appearances don't necessarily contain all there is to know about the thing that appears. Appearances may be incomplete. They will correlate perfectly, but not completely. They don't need to disclose everything there is to be disclosed about the thing that appears. In exactly the same way, I think memories go into the collective unconscious. The inanimate physical world is the appearance of that collective unconscious, but we shouldn't think that we have to be able to measure those memories as states of the inanimate physical world, because appearances aren't necessarily complete. Appearances don't necessarily tell all there is to tell about the thing that appears. And since memories don't appear in the physical appearance of the dissociated entity, in other words, the living organism, memories don't seem to correlate with it. When they sink into the collective unconscious, I don't think we'll be able to find them in physical states of the world, because memories, it would appear that only states of the present have physical appearance. This seems to be consistent throughout nature. You cannot take a telescope and show me the future. You cannot take a telescope and show me the past. And now cosmologists will say, every time you look up to the night sky, what you see is the sky the way it was at least 4.5 years ago, which is the number of light years to Alpha Centauri, if I remember correctly, the closest star. So you are seeing the past. No, you are seeing an image that correlates with the past, but that image is made of photons that hit the optical sensor of your telescope now. Everything that is physical corresponds to the present state of that which is making the measurement. Memories are not the present, memories are the past. They don't seem to have a correlation with physicality, because physicality seems to be eminently a reflection of what we call the present, not a reflection of what we call the past. So if this is a regularity of nature, then for exactly the same reasons that we can't find memories in the brain, we won't be able to find them in the inanimate physical universe. And yet they are there, immanent in it, just not appearing in the appearance, because appearances are not complete.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And also, we're throwing back into the mix that what we know as physicality is excitations in the infinite field of subjectivity. So then even physicality needs to be, in a certain sense, amended, deconstructed into basically excitations of this primordial field that we were talking about before, because otherwise there's this innate tendency to do what? Just reify yet again. Second thing here, Bernardo, is correct me if I'm wrong, but the kind of the bilocation of the collective unconscious, that I think it resides in two so-called locations. One is the embodiment as a seemingly physical, inanimate world, but it has this internal, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, collective unconscious is actually being within the matrix of our own body-mind collection. And so in a certain way, is it fair to say that we're somehow sandwiched between these two expressions of the collective unconscious?
That is one image. We are trying to visualize it spatially, which is all we can do because that's how our cognitive system is put together. It takes space as the dimension along which it organizes its data. That's how we think. We think spatially. That's why there is a distinction between subject and object here and there and all this stuff. If we try to visualize the collective unconscious spatially, we have to keep in mind that it is a concession. The collective unconscious precedes the cognitive structure that imposes spatiality on existence. Existence has structure, but it may be pure semantic structure, structure of meanings, not necessarily a structure of distribution along the dimensions of space. That's how our cognitive system projects meaning information in order to be able to compartmentalize things and make sense of things. Space are the drawers in our filing system. If we don't file things in different drawers, we get cognitively overwhelmed and then we don't survive. So we evolved to organize information about the world along the drawers that we call the dimensions of space. But this is what we do. It's not how that information exists in and of itself before we observe and organize it and file it. So the collective unconscious as it is non-spatial. It's a web of meaning, of semantic associations that can be embodied or projected in space, but isn't spatial fundamentally. It's a cognitive structure. It's a structure of meaning relationships. If we try to project that spatially, then yes, then the collective unconscious in its totality is both within us and outside of us.
Beautiful.
And it sounds contradictory, but that's what you get when you try to fit reality into the cognitive projections of monkeys. You can't avoid this.
Right, and again, I think we talked about it last time, the extraordinary dictates of Aristotle's laws of thought and logic. We still live so much in Aristotle's world when these concepts are more dialetheist, they're and or. I mean, they're more and instead of just either or. All right, wonderful. So this is actually what I was most excited to talk to you about, Bernardo, is with your permission, I want to read one very short thing, and then this ties into my experiences in the dark practice, where I want to share a little bit with you. And because this is a topic that is implied in, like, here's one quotation in More Than Allegory that suggests this, but again, I haven't found it overtly in your work yet. The most fundamental reality is a form of emptiness pregnant with infinite potential. And so in Buddhist languaging, obviously the emptiness is there, but the infinite potential in this particular tradition is what they would refer to as luminosity. And so I want to talk a little bit about the place of light in mind, reality, epistemology, and ontology. And I want to do this in a couple of ways. One is this investigation was seeded to me years ago when I was contemplating the nature of my dreams. And that obviously in this waking state, I see these appearances in the world, obviously because of photons reflecting off of these objects from a particular light source, whether it's the sun or this artificial light. But yet when I'm in a dream, I say with as much conviction and veracity as I say here, I'm seeing this dream. I'm seeing whatever in the dream. Well, I started reflecting like, well, pardon the pun, but where does that light come from? There's no light source behind me somewhere. Where is the light that gives rise to my illusory interpretation that I'm seeing this. And so I started really reflecting on the notion of the light of the mind. And this ties into two things. One is I'm going to share two things. I know you're cautious about the work of David Bohm, superdeterminism and hidden variables. I totally get that. But he says some pretty cool things about this. Two things that you may or may not have heard that I think are quite compelling. It may be commonplace to you with your knowledge of quantum theory, but here we go, and nonetheless. So this is David. Mass is a phenomena of connecting light rays which go back and forth, sort of freezing them into a pattern. So matter, as it were, is condensed or frozen light. Even Einstein had some hint of that. You could say that when we come to light, we are coming to the fundamental activity in which existence has its ground. Light, in its generalized sense, not just ordinary light, is the means by which the entire universe unfolds into itself. Particles are ripples on this infinite ocean of light. And then here's the best. The mind may have a structure similar to the universe, and in the underlying movement we call empty space, there is actually a tremendous energy, a movement. The particular forms which appear in the mind may be analogous to the particles, and getting to the ground of the mind may be felt as light. And so I find this really, really compelling. And last thing, because I really want to send this in your court, is this became incredibly profound and powerful for me in my dark practice. Because when you go in for days, weeks, even months on end, at a certain point, when you've cut through, this is again is this kind of dropping through the sedimentation levels of the unconscious mind. At a certain point, I would argue even below the collective unconscious, my languaging, the collective super unconscious, which is this underlying matrix field of cognitive light. And so you're in the dark, Bernardo. It's pitch effing black. I mean, it's so dark you take a nap with your eyes open, and you know because you wake up and your eyes are dry. It's that dark. And then so what happens after a certain amount of time in there, and these are not entopic visions, because I've done the research on this. These are not just leukocytes flowing through your capillaries. Lights start to appear. It's pitch black, and emptiness, darkness is homologous to emptiness. That's why you go into the dark. Out of the emptiness then arises the luminosity, the light. And so these lights are incredibly compelling because they arise, then they start to form. These are the primordial archetypes of the manifest world. So you're in there, and talk about deconstructing self-sense. Who is seeing what? Where are these lights appearing? Space-time is deconstructed, self and other are deconstructed. And you're left with this amazing play of the light, which sometimes literally, Bernardo, when you look around, and you write about this as the universe being a kind of a topological analog to the structure of mind, it's as if I'm walking outside in the galaxy. There's just lights, because the sun has set and there's all these dots of light. And then the lights form and they do all these amazing things, which are highly articulated in the Bardo yoga tradition. This is what they say allegedly happens, in fact, when you die. So much more to say about that. But talk to us a little bit about your understanding relationship of what I just threw your way, the relationship of mind to light, both this kind of light and what you want to call either cognitive or metaphysical light and darkness. I find this so compelling that I'm curious to see what you have to say.
I will not contradict the intuition you have about it. I find it appealing and compelling too, but I also think it's a territory full of linguistic minds. We can get trapped by words here and very easily. This goes back. I don't know whether you want to go that far back. This goes back to Goethe's theory of light. Goethe, the great Goethe, thought Newton was an idiot when he described light and the way Newton described as waves. And he came up with an alternative theory of light. But if you go back to that material, not only with the eyes of today, even professors from the University of Vienna who were contemporaries with Goethe understood the same thing. They said, Mr. Goethe, you are conflating the phenomenology of light with the physics of light. Because what we call light can be the experience of light, that which you can dream of. but it can also be the physically measurable photon, which is there whether we have the experience of light or not, because we can measure it with photodetectors. These two things are not two, they are ultimately one, but at a certain level of abstraction and discourse, it is not only useful, but important to separate them. Because yes, they are partial aspects of one and the same thing, but we shouldn't conflate these aspects of the one and the same thing. So I think that's the first thing we have to keep in mind, even though everything is the same at the bottom level of reality, at the foundations, we use words to refer to different aspects of it, and we shouldn't conflate these aspects. So when we say light, if we mean by it the phenomenology of light, the experience of light, then light exists in dreams. If we say that what we mean by light are measurable photons, then there are very, very, very little photons inside your skull when you are dreaming. There is a tiny bit of bioluminescence, but it's negligible, and it certainly cannot account for your experience of light during a dream. Now, David Bohm's passage presupposes something that I think all of us in physics think is true, but nobody has managed to describe it or operationalize it, which is the notion of a unified field. Today, the current state of the the best models we have of physics today, which is called the standard model of quantum field theory, we postulate, I believe the last count is 17 different quantum fields. And particles are excitations of the field, like a ripple on the river or on the lake. There are 17 lakes piled on top of one another, and a particle is a ripple in a lake. And a ripple in one lake can impinge on another lake and create a ripple on the other lake. And we model this today still with what we call Feynman diagrams, which is a pictorial shorthand to describe all these excitations and cross excitations of ripples on the fields, or excitations of the fields. The excitations or the ripples are what we call particles. But we have failed so far in unifying the 17 fields into a multi-dimensional but one field. We all sense that these 17 fields are just aspects of a unitary underlying reality that presents itself as if it were 17 fields, but it's actually only one. But we haven't managed to do the math to describe this one thing in a definitive way, in a determined way that presents itself as if it were 17. The math is so complex that the solutions to the equations, there can be 10 to the power, I don't know, a couple of hundred different solutions, meaning you can't predict anything. You leave everything open when you try to model that way. But we still think that even if the intelligence of monkeys can't describe it, there is something like a unified field. There aren't 17 fundamentally distinct, although interactive fields in nature. And that's what Bohm was basing the paragraph you read to me on, because unless you acknowledge or unless you believe that there is a unified field, then you cannot say that everything is photons. Photons are ripples in the electromagnetic field, but there are bosonic fields. There is the Higgs field, which is a bosonic field. There are other fields. There are 16 other fields. So unless we can unify them, we cannot say that everything is a photon. If we do unify them, then yes, you can say everything is light, but then you can equally say everything is electricity. Everything is mass. Everything is a boson. Everything is an electron. Everything is a photon. So for the same reason, you can say everything light. Then you will be able to say that everything is what we call the excitations of one of the other fields. You see? So I'm coming at this from the perspective of reason and evidence, not from an introspective perspective, which and I'm very open to the possibility that introspection leads us to deeper truths than reason and evidence. The reason I don't go there, there's a real reason and a reason I like to believe in. The reason I like to believe in is that I'm playing a cultural game, and the cultural game has to be played in terms of communication, and all we can communication is reason and evidence, not first-person insight. It's not communicatable. And also, we can do a lot better with reason and evidence than we've been doing today. That's why I focus on it. The reason I like to pretend is the real one. The real reason I don't do it is because I can't. I'm not a spiritual person. I'm a very hard-headed, extremely analytic person. I just don't have the skills. It's not in the cards. Nature has dealt to me. You know, we all are born with certain strengths and weaknesses. I have this absolutely vast, gargantuan weakness. And now I'm 50. I'm turning 50, and I'm in peace with it now. You know, there was a time in my 30s I was not. I would curse my own intelligence with the idea that it has cost me that other side of being human that I lack vastly, and that other people don't, like that monk who self-immolated. So I regard that like a person regarding a demigod almost. Why? Because I don't have it. It's not in me. But I don't deny then that there is a profound truth that is communicated symbolically under the notion that everything is light. I can elaborate on why everything is nothing. That I found a way based on reason alone to elaborate on. And it goes like this. The most explanatorily powerful, coherent, and reductive account of nature is to say that there are only experiences, because everything that isn't an experience is per force a theoretical abstraction that we should do only if we need. If we can account for all of nature with experience alone, then we should stay there. That's the principle of parsimony, or Occam's razor. And I think we can account for all of nature based on experience alone, but experience is varied. There are many, countless different experiences that are possible. How can we reduce that all to one? Well, by saying that every experience is a particular ripple, a particular pattern of excitation of one underlying field of subjectivity. And then you reduce all experiences to the field that gets excited. You reduce all the notes to the guitar string that vibrates to produce all the different notes. The problem is that what we call things are experiences. In other words, they are vibrations of the field of subjectivity. Therefore, the field of subjectivity, when it's not vibrating, is not a thing. And yet, there is only the field of subjectivity, because there is nothing to a vibration of it but the thing that vibrates. But it cannot be a thing. Beautiful. It has to be no thing. It has to be nothing, because things are its excitations. And it is not its excitations. A guitar string is not the notes it produces. If you're not plucking the guitar string and therefore it's not excited, it still exists. So subjectivity still exists in the absence of experience, because experience is an excitation of subjectivity. So that's what leads to both statements that are concurrently right. Subjectivity is everything, because everything is an excitation of it, and there is nothing to an excitation but the thing that is excited. Just as there is nothing to a note but the guitar string that vibrates to produce the note. So subjectivity is everything, but it's also nothing, because everything is per force an experience, and subjectivity is that whose excitations are experiences. So in and of itself, subjectivity is not an experience. It is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And it is possible to reconcile these two seemingly contradictory statements in your head. Subjectivity is everything, and it's absolutely nothing. It is possible to reconcile these two without great spiritual insight. You only need to be rigorous in how you're thinking about it and understanding the subtleties of how we flip the meaning of certain words. We could avoid this, we could avoid the contradiction by creating new words. But if we do that, nobody can understand us because we just created new pieces for the jigsaw puzzle and their meaning is not communicated at large. So if I am to stick to words that people understand, words that exist in our language, I incur this seeming contradiction. But if you think it through, you understand that it's not a contradiction at all. These are perfectly aligned statements. Everything is perforce nothing. There is no way out of it. And it's not that a part of it is everything and a part of it is nothing. No, no, no. It's fully nothing. And it is fully everything. And there is no contradiction here. And you do not need spiritual insight to understand this. So I'm comfortable with this. But I have not gotten to a point where I can say that everything is light. It's probably true, but I haven't made my way through reason to that conclusion the way I made my way to concluding everything is nothing, fully everything and fully nothing.
That's just spectacular. So a couple of things come to mind. This is just so rich. This is like the perfect definition of both emptiness and luminosity. So just to show you how this kind of cross-pollinates with the Buddhist approach to things, the no thingness aspect, of course, is emptiness. Perfect description of emptiness. The luminosity is they're inseparable. So luminosity is in fact the potentiality that you alluded to in the brief quotation that I sent back from you. The luminosity is in fact everything. And so there's this great, beautiful line from Kalu Rinpoche, a great meditation master, when he says, if I remember properly, there is a reality, you are that reality. When you discover this, you realize you are nothing, and being nothing, you are everything. Fantastic. And then a writer, you know, Nisargadatta Maharaj, wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I am everything. Between the two, my life flows. So what you're saying from, again, this is what I just so love about your work, the capacity to come to these highly resonant conclusions that are resonant, in fact, with these wisdom traditions. And so when I read it, I go, like, shit, Bernardo's talking, this is exactly what emptiness is. This is what luminosity is. And so it's both the elegance and the risk of these, you know, we don't want to have shotgun marriages where you're creating category errors and conflating these sorts of, you know, like outside light is neither the same nor different than the light of the mind. I think the kind of honesty really has to be kept there. So I so appreciate what you're saying. But the reason I riff on
If
this,
I can,
yeah,
just
please.
before you jump to the next question,
Yeah,
just to mention you an example. Years ago, my ex-wife sent me a video by somebody I know now who he is. At the time I didn't know, Adi Ashanti, or
yeah, I know Ajahn. I know
what's his
Ajahn.
name again? Gray. Well, Adi Ashanti. That's his.
I know. Yeah.
And there is a book by him, and I think a video as well. And the title was Emptiness Dancing.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought, oh, he's the real deal because nobody says something so spectacularly, seemingly contradictory like this without understanding the subtlety and nuance that is behind it. And I figured, no, he did. Now, and why? Because of what I mentioned. I think only subjectivity exists, and experiences are excitations of subjectivity. Therefore, subjectivity itself is not experienceable. Therefore, it's empty.
Exactly.
But everything that is emptiness dancing.
Yeah. And the dancing is the luminosity again.
Yeah.
So it's just
Yeah.
so, yeah, just sends
But I suspect very strongly that the nuance and depth with which he knows it far exceeds the conceptual games I play to come to the same conclusion, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. But it's a little bit like the conversation you had with Rupert and my friend Chris Wallace, is that at a certain point, and you say this yourself, is that when you're engaging in really the true art of contemplation, it's called a Shuddhavakalpa, a thought construct that is so in resonance with reality that eventually it/you collapses into reality. And then the map that's so sophisticated falls into the territory. And then you go, holy shit, aha, you know, there it is. It kind of self-liberates into it. And so many things here. One is that I clicked on, and why I'm so interested in this is you talked earlier about Neanderthal and ancestry. The Kaduma tradition, which is a post-Kabbalistic Jewish mystical tradition, is completely resonant with this view as well. that when we're talking about these kind of archetypal lights, we're talking about our primordial ancestors. And so in the wisdom traditions, this is what everything comes from. And the way they talk about it, Bernardo, is so bloody interesting. And again, I don't want to go too far astray here, but it's worth throwing into the mix this kind of equation of reality. This is my languaging, that R equals L plus E. Reality equals luminosity in union with emptiness. And so what happens that creates the schismogenesis that gives birth to runaway patriarchy, because the light is masculine in this tradition, everything that's happening in the Western world is a fundamental blinding by this primordial light. That what we know, and this is where it's resonant with what David was saying, David Bohm, is according to the non-dual Tantra and then Tibetan Buddhism, the entire manifest world is in fact made of this kind of runaway light. It's light that is actually primordially fractured. Here's this meta-crisis thing again, primordially divorced from the empty nature of things. The luminosity actually breaks away, goes into this guy's schismogenesis, that's Gregory Bateson's term, and then the end result is this runaway, fundamentally infatuation with frozen light, that we're literally blinded by the light of the mind. And so again, we're dancing between two worlds here, but I find this beyond profound, and it has tremendous explanatory power to me in terms of what actually happens at the very genesis of manifest reality, even the Big Bang, perhaps, but conjecture there.
I'm not at all surprised that you can see farther than I can in this regard, Andrew, because of the practices you have, which I don't. Again, I'm a kid who likes to tinker with computers. That's about who I am. Everything else is like an almost unbelievable film I watch. It's like, how did I end up here? How did this happen? But I don't have the intuitive sense that you have about the profundity of the light analogy. I'm not woke. I'm very critical of the exaggerations of woke. I think some of it is important and very, very useful. It's a step ahead, but there are lots of exaggerations. So what I'm going to say will sound a bit wokish, but it's not meant as such. There are people who are born blind or who can no longer see. So the light analogy, I think, overlooks the richness of life, of life and experience, when what we call light is not involved.
Right.
When I listen to a Wagner overture, like the Parsifal overture, which I think is unreal. It's like those are not even alien sounds. They are sounds from another reality. How does that come out of a human mind? Is that illuminating? Yeah, but not in the sense of light. There is another kind of luminosity there. So I think there is a bit of a danger with the light analogy, because it picks one out of the 5 or 6 senses and may not convey the proper richness of what's going on, which I think people who are blind can be entirely privy to without the light carrier.
Yeah, and this is where you know, the analogy breaks down, and fundamentally this light, by the way, is really fundamentally cognition, awareness itself. But we don't need to go too far astray there. I wanted to start to maybe tie a few things in and slowly start to wrap this up, because otherwise I'll keep you here all day, my friend. We've been talking all about the excitation in the field of infinite subjectivity, but if you suggested this, I haven't heard it. What initiates the excitation? What brings about the vibration, the excitation?
Well, clearly it is self-caused. It is what initiates it is an impetus that inheres in it. To be is to have properties. Something that has no properties does not exist. So if subjectivity exists, even though it is nothing, because it's not a thing, so it's no thing, subjectivity, pure and simple, is not a note of the guitar string. It is just the guitar string at rest. But if experiences are the notes, then that which gets excited to produce experience is not itself an experience. Lost my train of thought. I forgot where I was going with this. Can you trigger me
Yeah.
again?
So the idea is, in the infinite field of subjectivity, out of which everything arises to which everything returns. There's excitations of this field. What initiates those
Oh,
excitations?
yeah, the impetus. Yeah. Okay. So I hope I convinced the audience that to be is to have properties, even if what you are is a no thing, that no thing has to have inherent properties. Otherwise, there is nothing to talk about. It can't be excited because there is nothing there to get excited. So there has to be properties, potentialities to this no thing that is everything. One of these properties must be an impetus towards self-excitation.
Yeah.
And then it's not an external thing because there is nothing but that no thing. It comes immanently from within. It's one of the inherent properties of what there is. One of its inherent properties is to self-excite. It's what it does. Now, if you think of it as mind, the analogy is fantastic because how long does it take you in that sensory deprivation chamber before your mind reduces its self-excitation? Mind self-excites. That's what it does. It doesn't like to be resting in absolute in a vacuum of experience. It always causes itself to experience something. It always self-excites. So it has to be an inherent impetus to what there is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. In Buddhist tantric language, it's literally wind or movement. I mean, the propensity of mind to shine, to play, to just manifest is just inherent in the Hindus talk about the same thing. And so that's what's so powerful, Bernardo, about going into intense sensory deprivations where um, cessation is the primary ingredient. All avenues of distraction pulling apart, all avenues of movement are really taken away. And so in a very deep sense, you do enter the death space because you can no longer move. And as you, the heuristic, like why I do it is because if you can go through this deconstruction process, well, that's no small thing. Then you can perhaps come back in, move now, not driven by habit patterns, but or karma, but now move, manifest, shine out of love, kindness, compassion. So now you construct, you go into die, and you come out, I don't want to get too Christian here, but reborn with full intentionality. So this is what you write about so bloody brilliantly in More Than Allegory, about if we don't do that, we get lost in our imaginings. That's the classic definition for a non-lucid dream. I mean, the connections to this and lucidity is like insane. And so you go in there to deconstruct, to create, to flip non-lucidity into lucidity. That's a code word for awareness. So then you can reconstruct, you can rise from the phoenix. You can do so now voluntarily, not driven involuntarily by these excitations of habit and karma, but out of love, kindness, compassion. And then your entire work, your very being becomes a manifestation of that level of expression.
Yeah, yeah. I like to say that mind's first directive or prime directive is to deceive itself.
Yeah. Feynman
But
said
in
this.
deceiving itself, it reveals itself to itself.
It's fantastic. Fantastic. So two things, Bernardo, just before we close up. Two things here. In terms of where was I going to go here? I have one thing very specific. Oh, yes, Nietzsche. And you talk about this a lot. And again, if you don't want to go here, totally fair game to just say I pass. But I love when you talk about the philosopher, true philosophy must be lived. And you talk about the life of Nietzsche. Um, so how has your philosophy trickle down economics, right? Trickle down ideology, whatever you want to talk about it. How has your philosophy lived you? How is Bernardo from today different from the Bernardo who wasn't reflecting so concertedly, so deeply, so dedicatedly towards these teachings? Because this is super important, because otherwise, like we talked last time, oh my gosh, you're just stuck from here on up, and like, what's the point? So if you don't mind, people are
Yeah.
super interested about these personal interjections.
In the beginning, in the first years, I thought that I couldn't internalize my own philosophy. It stayed as a sort of conceptual game up in the head, in the canopy of my being, as opposed to the roots. And I believed it very sincerely because I thought the logic was solid. and the evidence substantiated it sufficiently. So I really believed it, but it didn't really change how I experienced myself in the world. I was still the same suffering idiot that I was before, which I still largely am. Um, and once I was meeting Rupert Spira,
Oh, yeah, Rupert Spira, sure.
and then I shared this frustration with him because I was convinced at that moment that even though the cards life dealt me were the cards of reason and evidence, I was convinced that those cards would never help me live a better life. That it was just a job I needed to do, and I was not dealt the cards that Rupert was dealt. Because I think I can share this with you. Rupert hardly ever experiences anxiety. He will not say that he never experiences it. He's human. He's alive. So he will always have some anxiety, but very little. And I had a lot of anxiety. Oh, the normal anxieties, the shit that can happen to you in the future or to those who you care about, everything that can go wrong in your life, the past and all that stuff. And then Rupert told me, I remember this very clearly. We were in an Italian restaurant drinking Italian wine. And he said, this will change. It will sink in. Even if you can't meditate, if you're not spiritual, what you are saying will sink in because it's not contradictory with reality. And and at the time I listened to him and I believed him, but again I believed him up here in my head. I didn't really believe him in my heart. I was absolutely convinced that I was condemned to have the same kind of emotional life I had before. A few years later, one day I woke up and I thought, my God, it did sink in a bit. He was right. and I and I briefly cursed his name, but in a nice way, in a loving way. I thought, Rupert, you, and in my head I said that lovingly, very lovingly, if you know what I mean. And then it's been now a few years since that realization, and now it's clear. I mean, I'm far from an enlightened human being. I can get angry very easily. I can get frustrated. The whole affair of what's happening in Ukraine and Israel and Palestine upsets me to the point that I really have to manage my media consumption very, very carefully. Otherwise, I become dysfunctional. So I'm far from an enlightened being. I'm not one that gives the other cheek to my attacker. I don't do that at all. Um, um, I am combative still, philosophically and in life in general. I will not go after anybody out of maliciousness, but if I am on the victim side, I'm not going to give the other cheek. I may react even more strongly than most people would. So I'm far from being an enlightened being, but a lot of things did change. And I think that's what you want to know. What changed? Empathy has grown a lot to the point that it edges on the dysfunctional. It's very important for us to, if we are to be functional in life, for us to be able to compartmentalize empathy and put it in a little drawer. You have to visit that drawer not to lose your humanity, but you cannot live there. You can visit it, but if you live there, it becomes dysfunctional. So that I realized, and that is the most difficult thing for me because since I was a very hard-headed idiot who had no empathy, I didn't mature to develop defense mechanisms against empathy. It wasn't something I ever needed to defend myself against. So I now that it has come, I'm sort of laid bare and naked to it. I don't know how to deal with it. I'm learning. Over the past year, I begun to learn. But so that was not good. Another thing that was not good is I have more death anxiety now
Wow.
because thinking that death is the end of consciousness is the belief that death is the end of all of your problems and worries and anxieties because there is nobody there to be worried, to be afraid, to be anxious, to be regretful, to suffer. So it's the end of all of your problems, guaranteed to come. You don't need to do anything about it. It will come. You will be liberated. You will be free. And now free from this mind that tortures itself so much. Now that that belief is absolutely gone because I cannot help but know that no, monkeys don't know the truth, but they know some of the nonsense that they can produce. They know what cannot be true. They don't know what definitely is true, but they know a few things that cannot be true. And I know one of the things that cannot be true is that death is the end of your consciousness. It is a comforting belief, but if you believe it, it creates so many other problems and contradictions elsewhere that are insoluble that it becomes clear that this can only be the conclusion of a very flawed line of thinking, and that all lines of thinking that have a chance of being true entail that consciousness continues after death. Not personhood, not individuality, not ego, but subjectivity continues. And I experience that as anxiety because the potential for suffering then continues. Then death is a major change in your state of consciousness, and you do not know what it's changing into. In the beginning, when I was in my 30s, I did several psychedelic trips as research, not as entertainment. And I went through ego dissolution several times, which people describe as death. And it is. You are dying. Your personal self is dying. First time it was horrible. Second time it was difficult. By the fifth time, no problem at all. I had no problems with ego death. I had problems with coming back, the re-entry. Yeah. I found that so overwhelmingly claustrophobic, I stopped tripping because it made me unhappy about life. It would take me 3 weeks until I was in peace with the fact that I was a person again. And that was not good. So I stopped. So I don't have fear of ego dissolution. That I think I'm a pro on that now. If that is forced on me, I just ride the wave. I have done it several times before. But I am afraid of the next state of consciousness. What is that? What is this state of expansiveness? Does it mean that I will inherit the memories of all the 6 million Jews tortured and killed by Hitler? You see? You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, totally.
So that's the other thing that changed, very, very real and modulates my emotional inner life, and it's not good. But there are good things. There's one very good thing. Finally, we'll finish this long answer. The best thing that has happened to me was the present, felt, self-evident understanding that my life is not about me, has never been, and can never be.
Beautiful.
This is the most liberating thing I have ever experienced because it frees me from the incredibly overwhelming responsibility for being happy and thinking of yourself as a failure if you aren't happy or if you aren't successful. And that notion that that's what life is about, is for you to be successful according to the criteria of this culture, or for you to be happy, and you're visualizing happiness not as contentment, but as a sort of a realizing all of your dreams, having the perfect trophy wife and your yacht, and that pressure is overwhelming when you feel that you're only worthwhile as a person if you succeed and if you're happy, which of course you aren't going to be. It's not natural for people to be happy all the time. It's natural for people to have contentment, which is something else. Success is an illusion. So that overwhelming pressure is gone. It's gone. I don't have to live to be 82, the average age for Dutch men at death. I don't have to live the average lifetime. If I do, great, I will pop a champagne. If I die when I'm 52 or 54, like my father, so long as I died at the right time, such that I complete the work nature is trying to do through me, I will only complete that when I die. That's my last act. If I do that well, so Bernardo Kastrup, the philosopher, can truly be born not as a farting, stinking pissing human being full of character flaws, but as the face of a certain worldview constructed by nature. If I do that well, I don't need to be 82. Given the chance, I would like to be, because I'm pretty content now, which is amazing. When you stop trying to be happy, then you get content. It's incredible
Okay.
how life works. When you stop the fight, then then you find that that flow of contentment was always there all along. So that I have that contentment, and that comes from the understanding, very felt, very real, very unquestionable. And I mean, I don't need to, I don't feel that I need to convince anybody about this, but I am convinced, and that's all I need. You know what I mean? I am absolutely convinced. I know that my life is not about me, has never been, and it will never be. And this has been incredibly liberating, that I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to succeed. I don't have to be happy. I don't have to live long. I don't have to acquire. I don't have to have a lot. You know, I don't have to be adulated, respected. I never wanted adulation, but I wanted respect. Um, I still do. My ego still does. But deep inside, if I'm not, no tragedy. You know, it's, I'm not going to lose my sleep on that. I may wake up in a bad mood, but that's about it. You know, so that, you know, two bad things and one good thing. But if you are, and another good thing, um, life is flooded with meaning for me now.
Mm.
The notion of a meaningless life has evaporated like water under the sun after a shower. It just it just vanished. Meaning now is, it's everywhere, everywhere. I'm immersed in it. It's always with me. It's not something I need to achieve. No, I live in it. I'm like a fish in the waters of meaning, effortlessly. It's right there. It's right there. Know what I mean? So that, and the liberation of life not being about myself, wonderful.
Huge.
Death anxiety, not good. Empathy, not good.
Yeah, those are really, really huge. I mean, it really, I mean, in my languaging, that being embedded in a world of meaning is sacred world. I mean, the world actually, it just becomes sacred, ordinary magic in that regard. And what you said earlier about the relaxation of aspirations and desires, this wonderful, the power of working with these reductionist approaches, very, very practically is fundamentally, when you're working with anything, you're always working with your mind, whether you know it or not. And so what came to my mind is a jingle that I often say to myself, that we often confuse the satisfaction of desire with its temporary transcendence. We think we're happy when we get what we want, but we're really actually happy when we've stopped wanting, which is why enlightenment, and especially the Buddhist tradition, is defined by terms of negation. You never actually attain enlightenment, you simply cease to be deluded. And so it's like nirodha, nirvana, nirgunas, negate, negate, negate. So this alone has profound, not only explanatory power, but economic power. If you really understand this in your bone, that you think you're happy when you get what you want, but like a good first-person scientist, you look very closely at your experience. Is that what's going on? No, I'm actually happy because I've stopped wanting. So you release the contraction, the constipation, you open, and then now you found the common denominator. This is like, now you have unconditional happiness. Now you solve the equation. And so now work on it introspectively. Now deal with the cessation of desire, which is why Gandhi died with all his worldly possessions fitting in a shoebox. I can't even get my books in a semi-van, right? So this
I,
has a lot of economic value, right? Simplification.
I have a friend, and my best friend, Fred Matzer, the founder of Essential Foundation.
Nice.
He has this wonderful analogy. He says, we are like a violin, and nature wants to play us. We have to allow ourselves to be played by nature, or allow ourselves to be lived by nature. But what we do with our little desires is we put a chewing gum on the chords, and then they don't really resonate, and everything becomes awful and dystonic because nature can't play the symphony it's trying to produce through us. And when he said me that for the first time, I was floored because I understood it. I really understood it in the core of my being. I had never had that thought. And then he just drops that bomb on me during a car ride in Carlsbad, California.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, you literally stop gumming it up, right? Just get out
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the way. Stop
And
gumming it up.
I
Bernardo,
was floored. I mean, he has floored me multiple times with this sudden
yeah,
statements that come out of nowhere. You know, that you're having a normal conversation about your day and the boat or well, no, whatever the news, and then he
boom.
suddenly, fires one of these statements, and it goes like, takes you aback. I have had this experience many times with him, but it's a perfect analogy for what I was trying to say. If you understand that your life is not about you, then you allow yourself to be played by nature, who is composing the symphony. That credit to Fred Matzer for this one, but the imagery is just right. He's been there. He knows it. That's why he knows how to describe it in a way that is disarming.
It's really beautiful. So, very last question. Um, what do you most want to know? There's so much that you've explored. There's so much that you've written about, your massive online presence. What right now, what do you most want to know?
The easy answer is there is nothing I really need to know. Um, if nature wants to know something else through me at some point, then then okay. Um, but right now, I mean, the diamond is still in my life. I'm still writing yet another book. I still have this clear sense of responsibility for allowing nature to do these things through me. But the real individual Bernardo, the kid that likes to play with computers, if the diamond tomorrow would finish this book and subtly inform me that my job is done, now my life is mine, you just play with computers. Just design computers. I'm working on designing something on AI right now, a large language model, um, for fun. I don't need to know anything. That's the easy answer. The more subtle answer, oh God, I don't know if you want to go there because this opens a whole other space. But I sense, and I sensed during my psychedelic trips, and the echo of that is large enough that I can still re-evoke that sense even now. I can re-evoke that. I can pull it back and experience that again. I sense that there is what I call a primordial itch. There is an itch nature's trying to scratch. And the reason it can't is that it cannot formulate to itself what the itch is. It cannot formulate to itself precisely what the question is. If it could, then the answer would be there. So it's not about the answer, it's the question.
Yeah.
I would like to know the question. And look, literature, there's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, number 42, when it's a fiction book. It's right here, there. Douglas Adams, he wrote about it, fictional civilization in another planet that builds this enormous computer to answer the question of life, the universe, and everything. And it takes them generations to build the thing. Finally, they build it and they start it up. And then the computer needs to crunch for 7 million years to get to the answer. And then generations later, the time has come. It's been 7 million years, and the entire population comes around the big computer. We will now finally get the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. So the computer cranks, and beep, it has the answer. What is the answer? And then the computer says 42. And then everybody goes, 42. But what is then the question? And then the computer says, oh, now another 7 million years until I can compute. I can compute the question.
Reverse engineering. That's
So
fun.
Douglas Adams, I bet with you, he's not alive anymore. We can't ask him, but he's been there. He has been in that place where the cosmic itch um, can be felt. There is a question about itself that nature absolutely needs to answer, but it can't formulate the bloody question. If it could, it would be through us because we have the higher level mental functions that are required for that, like self-awareness, separation between subject and its experiences, so you can deliberate and think symbolically and conceptually. But I don't think any one of us has succeeded, because there is a room in the palace of mind where the cosmic itch can be felt very clearly. So the difficult answer to your question in my case is, I would like to know what the question is.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now, this will sound all very abstract and crazy, but yeah, that's why it's the difficult answer.
Well, I think it's spot on. I mean, questions are more important than answers, aren't they? I mean, they send the mind in the right direction. And the way you ask your questions, I mean, Heisenberg spoke beautifully about this as well. The way you ask your questions is enormous. And so, yeah, that's really fantastic. The ability to, and then like we talked about earlier, Barella's whole notion of the power of the open question and what Zen calls don't know mind. Dr. John talked about it as divine ignorance, the capacity to be completely content with this magnificent, probably best answer of all. I don't know. Just the elegance of that type of surrender to the mysterium tremendum, right? I mean, that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I didn't surrender to it. I really want to know what the question
Yeah.
is. It has to do with the relationship between subject and object,
Hmm.
but I can't. The answer is latent. If we know the question, the answer will just pop.
Yeah.
But we haven't yet been able to formulate the question quite precisely. It is extraordinarily, inconceivably nuanced and subtle. And it requires us to dig through all the layers of self-deception, conceptual indirection, inner contradictions. You have to pass through all that, and then you need to precisely pin down the question. It's superhuman, and
Yeah.
that's why it's the perennial itch. It's the cosmic itch, probably the source of the impetus that causes the excitations of the big subject.
High five. That's fantastic right there, isn't it? Yeah, right there is that which creates the excitation of the
Yeah,
field.
the cosmic itch. It needs to scratch it, but it doesn't know how.
It's just beautiful. Bernardo, man, I can't thank you enough. I really, I truly, I know how busy you are, and for you to take your time to hang with me and my audience like this, it just means the world to me.
I
Amazing
just like
stuff.
talking to you. It's not.
No, I so appreciate even that is really moving to me. And this is what makes you so different from the classic scientist, scholar, or whatever, is the willingness to reveal your interiority, the willingness to actually share your heart. In the Buddhist tradition, it's interesting, Bernardo, when you go to India and Nepal, when they say mind, they never point here. They always
It's
point
the
here.
heart.
Yeah, both in Pali and Sanskrit, same word for mind is heart is chitta. And so this is what makes you truly unique. You can dance between these amazing altitudes of the mind and heart, bring them in resonance, and this is why you are becoming justifiably the superstar that you are, the rock star. And so I really
I'm not that. Maybe I look like that, but I'm the kid playing with computers, and
right.
really,
I understand,
really,
but you're being mandated onto this platform, and it's bringing tremendous benefit to the world. I know personally from people that I talk to, and as I talk to and continue to propagate the nobility of your work, you're doing some really damn good things. So the kid with the computer is really doing some wonderful things in the world, and so deep of gratitude on behalf of me and my entire community, and may we do this again for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? This is
sure. And I will pass on your words to the diamond.
so great. All the best, my friends, and much love. Hope to
You
talk to
take
you.
care.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Thanks. Bye.